Chapter 271. Fu Su did not know that the Yuanwu emperor inexplicably felt a threat of disgust when he looked at his features. He walked quickly in joy and wanted to reach Ding Ning in one step. You prepare to go and see Ding Ning like this? But at this time, an old and benevolent voice sounded behind him. Fu Su turned in shock. The old man in plain satin robes was behind him. Minister Yen. Fu Su bowed respectfully to this old man and said in puzzlement, "You mean?" This seemingly ordinary old man was naturally one of the two ministers of the Qin dynasty, Minister Yen. On the eve of the Deer Mountain Conference, Yangshan Commandery had been taken back by the Qin dynasty. In that battle, the famous Chu general Fan Donglu had died under the sword of the Qin dynasty empress. But everyone knew that the one responsible for commanding the army was Minister Yen. To be able to have such an army enter Yangshan Commandery without being detected by the dynasties, this was enough to show how terrifying this old man was. Jing Liuli will not let you see that white goat cave youth. Minister Yen bowed in return and said in a harmonious voice, "Actually, if it was anyone else, they would not agree to let you see that white goat cave youth." Fu Su stilled and said, "Why?" "Because the Min Mountain Sword Trials are an internal matter of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Min Mountain Sword Sect will not let anyone interfere and change the course of the trials, not even you." Minister Yen looked at Fu Su and smiled slightly. He said, "Even if many things can be done, they need to consider the rules and face, and cannot be done openly." Fu Su reacted and said sincerely, "Minister Yen, please help." Minister Yen smiled and nodded in agreement. Looking at Fu Su's overjoyed expression, he smiled self-mockingly inside. He knew that after today, this new crown prince would start to understand what balance and power were. Ding Ning was in a deep sleep. It could even be said that he slept deeper than any previous sleep. This was not because he was too tired, but because this was the trials of Min Mountain Sword Sect. It was safer than any other place in Chongling. Before the third challenger appeared, the valley was quiet. However, as the sound of footsteps rang out, the light in front of Ding Ning slightly distorted. A middle-aged man in green robes appeared in front of Ding Ning. The moment this middle-aged man in green robes appeared in front of Ding Ning, Jing Liuli's figure also appeared in the empty space outside the hut. Jing Liuli looked at the middle-aged man's back with a cold expression. She didn't say anything, but she was ready to draw her sword. This middle-aged man dressed in indigo robes was one of her sect uncles. His status in Min Mountain Sword Sect was extraordinary, but he should not have appeared here. "Do not be nervous. I am just following the sect master's orders to come alone and ask him a few questions." The middle-aged man in green robes naturally sensed Jing Liuli's murderousness, but his expression was natural, and he spoke coolly without even turning his head. Jing Liuli's brow furrowed slightly. She did not say anything. Her figure moved and she disappeared from the cliff. The middle-aged man smiled slightly. A breeze formed between him and Ding Ning and blew at Ding Ning's forehead. The breeze naturally carried some cold water droplets that wet Ding Ning's forehead. Ding Ning woke up. He saw this unfamiliar Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator standing in front of him recover absolute lucidity in a breath. Seeing Ding Ning's muddy and dazed gaze turn to absolute clarity and wariness, the middle-aged man once again praised in his mind. Then he smiled slightly and said apologetically, "Apologies for disturbing your rest. I did not come to urge you to proceed with the following sword trials. I am just a lobbyist." Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. He first sensed the movements in his body. After confirming that there was nothing unusual about his body before this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator arrived, he started to look seriously at this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator. Looking at this middle-aged man's clean and fine face, he was sure this middle-aged man was unfamiliar to him. "What is your name?" Ding Ning did not stand up, but continued to lean against the wall and asked. "He Shanjian." The middle-aged man smiled and answered simply. Ding Ning looked at him and said, What do you want to say? He Shanjian glanced at him and said, I have come on behalf of the Crown Prince. Ding Ning frowned and did not speak. He Shanjian continued, the Crown Prince pleaded for you in front of the Holy One. Because you are the Crown Prince's friend, the Holy One agreed. If you do not win, there will be a place for you in Chongling in the future. Ding Ning bowed his head and said, I know. He Shanjian stilled. There will be a place for you in Chongling in the future. This was the Holy One's personal promise. Even he could not help but feel jealous of such a promise. But this youth in front of him just said lightly, I know? He could not help but look at Ding Ning and ask, Do you know the true meaning of the words I brought? Ding Ning did not look up and said, I know. He Shanjian frowned deeply. He thought for a long time and asked, You are not prepared to say anything? Ding Ning shook his head. He Shanjian took a deep breath and his frown deepened. But he did not speak more. He nodded to show he had heard, and then turned to walk out of the hut. The light on the cliff flickered. He Shanjian's figure floated on the cliff path like a flickering light and passing shadow, heading toward the bright yellow palace in the distance. Every time the corner of his eyes caught sight of that bright yellow color, his gaze would become even more fervent. He knew that after he left Min Mountain Sword Sect today, there would be a vast world waiting for him. Fu Su was waiting anxiously on the steps not far from the palace. He saw He Shanjian's figure in the distance and his gaze quickly grew heated. He wanted to immediately ask He Shanjian what Ding Ning had said. But at this time, He Shanjian's figure suddenly stopped. The flickering figure stood like an ice sculpture on the green jade path between the mountains. The light rays that were originally flickering between the cliffs were broken by an invisible force. This powerful force seemed to pierce through the sky. The mountain path in front of He Shanjian became brighter and brighter. Fu Su's eyes widened. He did not know what had happened, but felt unusually anxious. A white figure appeared on the bright green jade mountain path. This person was clearly a cultivator of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Among all the cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect, only one cultivator was obsessed with cleanliness and liked to wear unusually clean white robes. He was naturally different from all the other Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators who wore jade robes. This person was the master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Bailey Sushu. Fu Su was shocked speechless. His eyes hurt because of the brightness. But inexplicably, when he faced other Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators before, the sword essence was so blinding and painful that he could not see the other's true appearance. But facing this legendary master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, even at such a distance, the other's figure grew clearer. The other scenery on the cliff was not clear, but Bailey Sushue's figure grew clearer in his eyes. He even saw Bailey Sushue's face clearly. The legendary master of Min Mountain Sword Sect was a slender man with long black hair and a face that could be described as beautiful. He was prettier than most women in Chongling. Time had not left any marks on his body. He looked extremely young, just in his 20s. Dressed in white robes, Bailey Sushua looked coldly at He Shanjian, who was standing stiffly on the path. The eagerness in He Shanjian's eyes had long disappeared and turned into terror. Is Min Mountain Sword Sect not good? Bailey Sushua said. His voice was very soft and very pleasant to the ear, very pleasant to the ear. But He Shanjian's body seemed to have countless icicles clanging and giving off cold energy, causing his body to tremble uncontrollably. Is it not better than fighting for power and not being able to control yourself outside? Bailey Sushua looked coldly at him and said. He Shanjian took a deep breath and could not control his trembling. But he still bowed deeply and said, I am following orders. Sect Master, please consider our past relationship and let me live. A hint of disdain flashed through Bailey Sushua's eyes. Even if you have been working for Jing Xiu or other people, I may have let you live because we are both cultivators of the Qin dynasty, and you have not done anything out of line in my sword sect for so many years. But you did something wrong. He Shanjian broke out in a cold sweat. He knew he could not escape, but he was extremely unwilling and puzzled. He could not help but shout, "What did I do wrong? If you only wanted to be a lobbyist, you could have found another reason to get close to that student." Bailey Sushua looked at him with disgust, and said in a cold voice, "But you were wrong in using my name and saying that I told you to ask that student something?" He Shanjian was stunned. In the next moment, his body was filled with great terror. He opened his mouth to howl, trying to see if he could escape to that yellow palace. But the moment he opened his mouth, he found he could not speak. There was a white light at his throat. Then his body fell backward. The moment he hit the ground, the white light came out of the back of his head, and cold energy spread through his body. He immediately turned into a corpse covered in thick white frost. Bailey Sushua looked at He Shanjian's corpse, which did not have a drop of blood, and frowned in disgust. He did not look back, but knew that Fu Su was gaping in shock, but unable to make a sound. "Everyone knows I am petty. Min Mountain Sword Sect has its own rules. Anyone who wants to play with power will have to pay a price. You should be able to remember this lesson." Bailey Sushua had a scornful smile as he said mentally to the crown prince of the Qin dynasty. Then his figure disappeared from the cliff. Behind the shocked and speechless Fu Su, Minister Yen just smiled. This was his first lesson to Fu Su. Chapter 272. In the eyes of the truly powerful like Prime Minister Yen, killing with a sword was always the lowest tactic. Playing with balance and controlling multiple factions in the palm of one's hand was the true skill. As a crown prince and the future successor to the Qin dynasty, he had to at least know the consequences of each decree he gave, and the price he would pay. Palace attendant Rong naturally understood these principles better than most people in Chongling. So when she heard the report that a powerful Realm 7 cultivator had been killed on the path by Bailey Sushua, who rarely showed himself, a cruel and cold smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. Even a person like He Shanjian could be casually sacrificed. A genius who was fated to age early due to his excessive energies was nothing to Chongling. In Chongling, any cultivator was the personal property of the Holy One and the Empress. If other people wanted to use a piece of jade in the Imperial Palace, it was a capital crime. But the master of the Imperial Palace might just put that piece of jade on the ground as a decoration. She regretted that Ding Ning had not seen Bailey Sushua kill He Shanjian with his own eyes. In this case, she felt that Ding Ning might understand that his struggle was meaningless to the truly powerful of Chongling. Min Mountain Sword Sect did not intend to conceal the fact that Bailey Sushua, the sect master who had not shown himself for a long time, had killed He Shanjian. When palace attendant Rong received the report, the news had spread through the cliff. Almost all the cultivation teachers who had come to watch the trials were in great shock. Even though He Shanjian had been working for the court in these years, even if he had leaked many matters of Min Mountain Sword Sect to the Chongling Imperial Palace, he had not colluded with the enemy. He was just working for the court. Also, the Yuanwu Emperor was still in Min Mountain Sword Sect. What kind of courage did Bailey Sushua have to kill He Shanjian in front of the Yuanwu Emperor? Jing Liuli turned to look at the mountain path where He Shanjian's corpse was. The light in front of her quickly twisted. Bailey Sushua seemed to pass through a strange door of light and appeared in front of her. Other people could not see the legendary master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, but she had seen him often. So she did not have much surprise on her face. She bowed respectfully and said, "Master? That young man is very interesting. It's just that the path some people start on is often different from the path they end up on. Since there are so many people who want to talk to this young man, and there are so many little ghosts, let them talk to their heart's content and let the little ghosts show themselves." Bailey Sushua looked coldly at Jing Liuli, said a few words, and then turned, disappearing into the twisted light. Jing Liuli lowered her head and thought for a moment, understanding the meaning of Bailey Sushua's words. The feelings of all the teachers of the various cultivation places on the cliff quickly became more and more complicated. They were told that in the last segment of the sword trial, they could enter the valley for a closer look. Being able to enter the valley and observe meant that it would be much easier to send messages to the students. Even more importantly, Min Mountain Sword Sect may not stop some people from sending messages to the students. This would make He Shangjian's death seem meaningless, like a joke. Was Min Mountain Sword Sect not afraid of becoming the second Bazin Kendo ground? At this time, many people started to sympathize with White Goat Cave, and even the Green Vine Sword Academy. Because at this time, the third and fourth people to pass the trial appeared in the Sea of Brambles. Zhang Yi and Su Lianhua's figures slowly appeared from the shadows of the cliff. When Zhang Yi had encountered Su Lianhua, at least a dozen students had been closer to the exit than him. But because he had not been wounded, and his guess had been correct, no new imperial insect swarms had threatened him and Su Lianhua along the way. He and Su Lianhua had become the third and fourth people to pass after Yi Zhengnan. While Yi Zhengnan was ahead of Zhang Yi, he had already left the trials. Su Lianhua had been carried out by Zhang Yi, so Zhang Yi was equivalent to the second student to pass the Sea of Brambles and qualify for the trials. Palace attendant Rong, who represented the mistress of the imperial palace, did not want to see the cultivators of White Goat Cave stand out in the trials, but these two youths from White Goat Cave had played a great joke on her. Many people started to worry that the mistress of the imperial palace would vent her anger on White Goat Cave and Green Vine Sword Academy because of Bailey Sushue's joke. Did we come out too late? Zhang Yi looked at the silent mountain valley and could not help but feel ashamed. Su Lianhua's eyebrows rose. He wanted to scold Zhang Yi's stupidity. With his strength, he had suffered such serious injuries. How could other people have come out faster than them? But when he thought of how Zhang Yi was smarter than him most of the time, he controlled himself and said, "Put me down? Why is there no one here?" Zhang Yi looked in shock at the empty mountain valley and the seemingly empty hut. He turned his head hesitantly and said, "Should I carry you to the hut and put you down?" Su Lianhua could not help but say angrily, "What does it matter if we take a few more steps or a few less steps?" Zhang Yi seemed to realize that he was being overly sentimental. He put down Su Lianhua in embarrassment and walked forward a few steps. Then he gave a shout of joy. Su Lianhua bumped into the back of Zhang Yi, who had suddenly stopped. His wounds immediately hurt. He could not help but say angrily, "What are you doing? Be softer." Zhang Yi looked back at him with unspeakable joy. "You are so loud, but you tell me not to be loud?" Su Lianhua felt that there was something wrong with Zhang Yi's head. But when he saw the scene in the hut, he immediately understood why Zhang Yi was like this. He is first again? Looking at Ding Ning, who was leaning against a pillar and sleeping behind a table, and seeing that Ding Ning did not have many obvious wounds, and confirming that there was no one else near the hut, Su Lianhua grew silent and felt respect. Once or twice could be explained by coincidence, but too many coincidences were inevitable. "My junior sect brother is really extraordinary." Zhang Yi entered the hut. When he arrived in front of Ding Ning, he did not know what to do. Su Lianhua was even more silent. This was because he saw that the tables in these huts only had the simplest gauze used to stop bleeding, and there was no special treatment medicine. He took a deep breath, grabbed some gauze, and walked to a sunny open space behind the hut. He started to take off the tattered clothing that had completely stuck to his wounds. The stuck clothing and blood scabs peeled off his body. His eyebrows twitched and his wounds started to bleed again. Zhang Yi walked behind Su Lianhua and saw that after Su Lianhua peeled off the clothes and scabs on her body, she let the wound bleed and did not immediately bandage it with hemostatic gauze. He could not help but ask, "You don't know how to bandage?" Su Lianhua looked helplessly at Zhang Yi, who thought of him as an ignorant child. He said, depressed, "Of course not." Zhang Yi stilled and said, "Then what are you doing?" You also see that there are no other medicines here. Min Mountain Sword Sect wants us to participate in the following trials with wounds. Su Lianhua raised her head and narrowed her eyes to look at the scorching sun above her head. She said slowly, "My master once told me that in a situation where there is no other way, sometimes one's own blood and sunlight can be a kind of medicine for fresh wounds. Basking in the sun is useful?" Zhang Yi looked suspiciously at Su Lianhua's bleeding wounds. Using the wind and sunlight to make the wounds naturally clot, and then using gauze to stop the bleeding is definitely more useful than using gauze to forcefully stop the bleeding now. Su Lianhua looked down at his bleeding wounds. After a moment of silence, he said, "I hope it is useful." Zhang Yi knew that Su Lianhua's condition was not optimistic. He swallowed hard, feeling the warmth of the sun, and said seriously, "I also hope it is useful." Su Lianhua did not respond. He took a deep breath, raised his sword, and cut away some of the rotting things on his wounds. Sometimes, the best use of friends was to accompany. Zhang Yi saw that Su Lianhua did not need his help. He hesitated and asked, "Basking in the sun is a good thing. Should I move my junior sect brother here?" Su Lianhua felt pain and said, "That is your junior sect brother. Whether he moves here or not has nothing to do with me." Thinking of Ding Ning's previous performance, Zhang Yi knew that even if Ding Ning woke up, he would quickly enter meditation or quickly fall asleep. So he smiled apologetically, returned to the hut, and carried out Ding Ning in the most gentle way possible. He folded some hay and laid it out. Then he put Ding Ning on it. They were both sleeping. He hoped that Ding Ning could sleep more comfortably and warmly. Seeing everything Zhang Yi did out of the corner of his eyes, Su Lianhua still felt that Zhang Yi was too meticulous and fussy. But he had to admit that anyone would hope to have such an easygoing and warm senior sect brother. Zhang Yi also began to treat his own wounds, and the entire valley became quiet again. At this time, there was another flash of light on the cliff. Another person had appeared. Chapter 273. A youth dressed in silver robes walked out of the shadows of the cliff. Just like Ding Ning, he did not have any obvious wounds. Even his silver robes looked new and did not have any cuts. Yet, for some reason, this youth looked even more tired and weak than Su Lianhua. When he looked up and saw the blinding sunlight, this youth's body swayed, as though he was unwilling to even raise his feet and wanted to sit down on the ground. However, the clear sound of footsteps could be heard from the stone path behind him. This silver-robed youth took a deep breath. He was not willing to let people see him so weak and powerless. He straightened his body and turned towards the cliff he had just walked out of. In the dim light, a few strange blood-like colors floated up. The silver-robed youth's brows furrowed. He suspected that he had used too much mental energy and now his senses were having problems. After a few more breaths of time, as the sound of footsteps approached, a thin figure appeared in his line of sight. "Ku Shichuan?" The silver-robed youth's pupils contracted slightly as he said in surprise. Because he did not want to appear too weak, this silver-robed youth's voice was even louder than usual. It spread far in this quiet mountain valley. Zhang Yi and Su Lianhua, who were quietly treating their wounds, heard it clearly. "Ku Shichuan?" Su Lianhua frowned. This name was not unfamiliar to all the young cultivators of Chongling. Su Lianhua could not understand why a Realm 3 first-class vital energy student from the Shadow Mountain Sword Cave would be ranked third on the Book of Talents, even surpassing Dugu Bai of the Dugu Marquisate establishment, who everyone thought would be first. "It is Exian." Zhang Yi glanced at Su Lianhua and was slightly shocked. Then he felt that Su Lianhua might have misunderstood and immediately added, "The speaker is Exian of Mind Chamber Sect." Exian? At this time, at the other end of the hut, a voice came from the exit of the cliff. "Are you very close to Exian?" Su Lianhua looked at Zhang Yi strangely and asked softly. Ku Shichuan was just a rising star in Chongling. Su Lianhua naturally did not have much interaction with him. As to Exian, While he was famous, Mind Chamber sect was a sect that focused on quiet cultivation. They were afraid their disciples would be tainted by the mortal world and would not let them out. So while Su Lianhua knew Exin, they did not have much interaction. Zhang Yi said bashfully, "I am not familiar with him. But when the Book of Talents came out, when my junior sect brother Ding Ning was forced to fight Zhou Xie, Exin spoke up for him, so I remembered him." Su Lianhua was slightly startled. "You only spoke a few words and you already remembered his voice. You have a good memory." Zhang Yi felt even more embarrassed and said, "You're too kind." Su Lianhua frowned and could not help but say, "While I know you are just being humble, do not be humble in the future. Otherwise, people who do not know your personality will think you are hypocritical." Zhang Yi stilled. The two were not familiar with Ku Shichuan and Ku Shichuan. Because of Ding Ning, Zhang Yi and Ku Shichuan had some differences, so he did not want to greet them and spoke in low voices. "I have long heard that the Mind Chamber sect's thought sword is unique. Even if you have not reached Realm 5, you can control a flying sword and make the sword energy seem alive. While I have not seen it with my own eyes, the rumors must be true. Otherwise, Brother E would not have passed first." At this time, the voice sounded from the exit of the cliff and clearly reached their ears. Hearing this voice, Su Lianhua stilled slightly. She immediately reacted and said with slight disdain, "Zhang Yi, you saw no one in the hut and thought that we were the last to come out. This Ku Shichuan is conceited. He saw no one in the hut and thought that no one had passed before him and Exn." Zhang Yi nodded and said softly, "Ku Shichuan is slightly conceited." The person speaking in front of Exin was naturally Ku Shichuan. Compared to the beginning of the trials, Ku Shichuan's appearance did not seem to have changed. There were no wounds on his body, and even his presence was calm. However, the threads of blood at the corners of his eyes were thicker. Looking at Ku Shichuan, who could be described as calm and composed, Exin's strange feeling grew. "My Mind Chamber sect's thought sword is famous, but in comparison, I fear that your Shadow Mountain Sword Cave's sword manual is more exquisite," Exin said slowly after a moment of silence. Ku Shichuan smiled unconcernedly. He turned around and looked at the mountain path he had come from. "No matter what, it is not that person who is first." Exin knew that the person Ku Shichuan spoke of was Ding Ning, who had been first in succession. However, he had no intentions of targeting Ding Ning, and was extremely tired right now, so he was not willing to respond. At this time, Ku Shichuan's smile quickly faded, because footsteps sounded from the cliff behind him. His gaze turned dark and cold. He was slightly worried that Ding Ning would appear at this time. But even if Ding Ning appeared at this time, he would be behind him. However, his pupils began to contract violently again, and a look of disbelief quickly spread across his face. What appeared in his line of sight was a tall girl. Among the students attending the trials, there were far fewer women than men. This young woman who walked out shocked Ku Shichuan more than any other woman. If Zhang Yi, who was several huts away, could see this young woman, he would not believe his eyes. The young woman who walked out was Xie Rou. While Xie Rou was famous in Chongling and Guanzhong, this was because she was the eldest daughter of the Guanzhong Xie family. She participated in many of the Guanzhong Xie family's businesses, and not because of her cultivation. Ku Shichuan had never thought that she could pass through the sea of brambles, much less appear so quickly. Xie Rou did not walk quickly and appeared to be struggling. Yet Ku Shichuan's expression grew even stiffer because he saw that Xie Rou was not injured. His gaze landed on Xie Rou's hand. Then his gaze grew even more disbelieving. A long sword like the black sword of the Qin dynasty was held by Xie Rou like a cane. Xie Rou did not have any other sword on her. "I heard what you said just now." At this time, Xie Rou walked out of the shadows of the cliff and into the sunlight. She glanced at the empty hut and then looked at Ku Shichuan with a sorrowful and angry gaze. She said, But even if he did not pass this trial, you are not as good as him. Ku Shichuan's eyebrows slowly rose and his expression turned cold. He could not help but think of Xie Chongqing. Xie Chongqing had liked to mock him in the past. But that was in the past. He could in the past, but that did not mean he could now. I do not understand what you mean. He coldly shook his head and said to Xiero. Thinking of the consequences of Ding Ning not being able to pass through the sea of brambles and win the trials, Xiero felt even more sorrowful. She gritted her teeth and was about to speak, but Ku Shichuan spoke first. A cultivator's ability is reflected in many aspects. If you insist that I am not as good as him in some areas, I have nothing to say. Ku Shichuan's lips curled into a sneer. If you say that I am behind him in the previous trials, I have nothing to say. But the trials only care about the final result. No matter how bright a shooting star is, it is still a shooting star. Xiero's body unconsciously trembled. Not seeing Ding Ning's figure, her mind was in chaos. She did not know what to say in response to Ku Shichuan's scorn. Ku Shichuan and Xiero's conversation clearly reached the hut in the distance. Looking at Zhang Yi, who wanted to speak but was hesitating, Su Lianhua could not help but sneer. Zhang Yi, are you deaf? You can still tolerate it even now. Did you have to wait until Xiero could not help but fight him before you say Ding Ning was here long ago? Hearing Su Lianhua's words, Zhang Yi, who had been considering whether he should be polite or not, suddenly woke up. His breathing paused and he was about to speak. But at this time, there was a muffled sound in the silent hut like someone was knocking on the wall. Ku Shichuan, Exin, and Xiero shook at the same time and instinctively turned to look into the hut. Zhang Yi and Su Lianhua were also stunned. Their eyes were filled with disbelief. Was there someone else in the hut? A deep red shadow appeared in front of Ku Shichuan and the others. Xiero was stunned. Exin was also shocked. Ku Shichuan's stiff expression eased. So it is. Why is there such an insect here? But at this time, a wave of exclamations sounded from behind the hut. Zhang Yi. Xiero was stunned for another breath of time before she reacted and cried out in surprise. Exin's expression immediately became spectacular. Ku Shichuan's heart sank to the bottom, and then he seemed to fall into hell. Do not be nervous, this insect is mine. A familiar voice that caused his body to stiffen rang out at this moment. Chapter 274. As this voice sounded, the mountain valley fell silent again. Xiero looked towards the back of the hut where the voice had come from and was excited beyond words. Exin felt extremely embarrassed. He thought he was the winner of this round and had not expected that many people had gathered behind the hut. Zhang Yi was very ashamed. He felt that he had caused too much of a commotion and disturbed Ding Ning's rest. Su Lianhua was shocked. He could not understand how Ding Ning could bring out such a long worm. Also, with such a long worm by his side, Ding Ning could sleep peacefully. Had this long worm really been tamed by Ding Ning? But how was this possible in such a short time? Each of them had different emotions. None of them ridiculed Ku Shichuan at this time. No one even looked at Ku Shichuan. Yet the moment Ding Ning's voice sounded, the black ice worm that had come out of the hut immediately stopped, and then slowly made a circle and crawled towards the back of the hut. It seemed to be very afraid, but did not dare to not return to Ding Ning's side. It also wanted to seek protection from Ding Ning, so its crawling appearance was very comical. Yet Ku Shichuan felt that this long worm seemed to be crawling on his face. Ku Shichuan was silent for a moment. In the end, he did not speak and walked towards a hut alone. Junior sect brother, Zhang Yi was the first to break the silence. He turned to look at Ding Ning sitting on the ground and wanted to apologize. Only you and Xiero came out? Ding Ning glanced at him and interrupted his apology. Zhang Yi was startled. Suddenly, he felt a little worried and nodded. What enmity do you have with Ku Shichuan? Su Lianhua could not help but ask. Zhang Yi shook his head and said, There is no enmity. Su Lianhua immediately frowned and looked at Zhang Yi in disbelief. If there's no enmity, why would you do this? Zhang Yi's expression became a little strange as he said in a low voice, "It's just that every time he said that junior brother Ding Ning was a failure, he would immediately be proven wrong. Many times before?" Su Lianhua thought about what Ku Shichuan had said to Exin just now when she thought she was the second to pass, and what she had said to Xiero. Looking at the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but shake his head in sympathy and said, "This is really tragic." However, this doesn't mean that there is no enmity between them. To be publicly slapped in the face while thinking that they were in the limelight, this is truly a great enmity. Su Lianhua's gaze landed on Ding Ning and the black iceworm crawling towards Ding Ning. She asked, "How are you able to bring out a worm like this from inside?" "Junior brother, this is Su Lianhua, we are friends." Zhang Yi knew that Ding Ning was not as good-tempered as he was. He feared that Ding Ning would be rude to Su Lianhua and hurriedly added. Ding Ning's expression did not change. He just glanced at Su Lianhua and said simply, "This is Min Mountain Sword Sect?" Su Lianhua stilled and immediately reacted. This was Min Mountain Sword Sect, and Min Mountain Sword Sect was the most stingy cultivation place. If not for Min Mountain Sword Sect's permission, no one could take away a blade of grass from Min Mountain Sword Sect. Before seeing you, I really thought I was the first to pass. Ding Ning, you are really strong. In the many years of the Min Mountain Sword Trials, only you were able to receive a reward from Min Mountain Sword Sect. At this time, Exion's voice sounded. He and Xiero had circled around the hut and came to the open space bathed in sunlight. Ding Ning looked at Exion and nodded in greeting. After a moment of silence, he said, "If Cave Master knew, he would be very happy." The place sank into silence again. The teachers of the cultivation places would naturally be very happy when a student won consecutively and did what all the other students had failed to do before. But it was a pity that Shui Wangshu could not see it. Regardless of whether it is meaningful or not, I still admire all of you. Exion was silent for a moment before he said seriously and sat down. Actually, Zhang Yi hesitated but still said softly, "In reality, we should all stand on junior brother Ding Ning's side. If possible, I mean, if it does not affect our chances of entering the Min Mountain Sword Trials. If possible, we should do our best to help junior brother Ding Ning win first." You are not wishy-washy at all this time. You have the courage to say such a thing. Su Lianhua turned to look at Zhang Yi and said with slight disdain, "You think this is a simple matter of treating someone to a meal?" Zhang Yi bowed his head slightly and did not dare to look at Su Lianhua's eyes. But he still said, "In reality, you should have heard some things about White Goat Cave. You all know that many things are not fair to White Goat Cave and my junior brother. I just think, if no one fights, then she can have any cultivation place she wants in the future. If no one stands on his side when someone comes out to fight, I think some people will not need to consider other people's feelings in the future. This is not helping my junior brother and White Goat Cave." Zhang Yi bowed his head and said sadly, "White Goat Cave no longer exists, and Cave Master is no longer here. This is helping all the cultivation places in Chongling. If I was a student of another cultivation place, I would definitely help if I encountered something like this." Exion and Su Lianhua were both shocked. Zhang Yi's words were reasonable. But even more importantly, even though Zhang Yi had many flaws, he was like a pool of clear water that anyone could see clearly. Everyone could see that Zhang Yi was sincere. The truth of a person like this, his sadness and self-blame, for some inexplicable reason, were exceptionally touching. Exion and Su Lianhua did not speak. Xiero was on Ding Ning's side. She naturally did not need to express any attitude. So no one spoke. Zhang Yi did not feel disappointed. He thought of something and turned around. Looking at the hut that blocked their view, he said, "Why don't we remove a few pieces of the walls of the hut?" This way we can see who has passed, and those who have passed will not think that no one has come out. This will prevent any misunderstandings and make people feel awkward." Hearing these words, Exin could not help but grimace. Zhang Yi was a person that people could easily see through. Even though he had only interacted with Zhang Yi for a short period of time, he could hear Zhang Yi's meaning now. It was not that he could see who had come out at a glance, but he was afraid that the people who came out would think that no one had come before them and say something embarrassing. Zhang Yi was thinking for others and did not want them to be embarrassed. Looking at Zhang Yi's profile, Exin could not help but sigh. He could not understand why Ku Shichuan had a grudge against them. Seeing no objections, Zhang Yi started to take down several pieces of wood from the hut facing them. Figures moved among the cliffs as more students came out. Zhang Yi looked up expectantly. He hoped to see Shen Yi, Xie Changxing, Nangong Kaishu and the others. But his heart immediately fell. The newcomer was dressed in pure white robes, and was clean and untainted. This was Yi Haoran from the Li Lingjun establishment. After taking down several pieces of wood, a door opened like some shops in falling parasol. Yi Haoran, who walked out of the shadows of the cliffs, easily met the gazes of Zhang Yi and the others. Seeing Ding Ning and Zhang Yi here, Yi Haoran's pupils contracted slightly. Then he saw that other than Xiero, Exin and Su Lianhua were also sitting. Yi Haoran frowned deeply. He frowned and looked silently at Exin and Su Lianhua. Exin and Su Lianhua also saw Yi Haoran's gaze. Then Su Lianhua glanced at Exin. Exin's expression was normal. He glanced at the warm sunlight above, and then slowly lay down on the wooden boards Zhang Yi had taken down. Yi Haoran's eyebrows rose. He did not look at the people here, and walked towards a hut at the side. "What is it?" Zhang Yi felt the atmosphere was not right and could not help but ask softly. "Sometimes you are very powerful, but sometimes you make people helpless." Ding Ning looked at him and answered, "Help or not be friends, do you have to say it?" Zhang Yi's body suddenly shook. He reacted and looked at Su Lianhua and Exin. His lips trembled. "Do not waste words." Su Lianhua waved her hand and lay down on the wooden boards Zhang Yi had taken down. "Do I have to thank you because I feel that lying on the boards you took down is more comfortable than sleeping on the ground?" Zhang Yi stilled and felt slightly ashamed. But moments later, he still felt that he had to do something for Su Lianhua and the others. He could not help but say, "Do you want to drink water? I see that there are already pots and stoves in the room. Should I make a fire and boil some water for you to drink?" Chapter 275. Su Lianhua wanted to say, "Why don't you go cook a bowl of noodles for us?" But looking at Zhang Yi's clean features, he felt defeated and swallowed his words. Rain clouds formed in front of the hut and it started to rain. Then smoke came out of the valley. Zhang Yi was not speaking casually. He really used a metal pot to catch the rainwater formed from his sword essence, and then started a fire to boil water. Many of the cultivation teachers on the cliff looked at the smoke rising from the valley and felt emotional. It was a solemn and heavy sword trial, but Zhang Yi made a fire and boiled water, adding the flavor of life and human touch to the streets for no reason. Many people knew that after Shui Wangshu and General Liang's battle, he had been recuperating in falling parasol. Usually, Zhang Yi and the others had taken care of him. Seeing Zhang Yi skillfully start a fire and boil water, many people imagined the scene of Zhang Yi carefully taking care of Shui Wangshu in falling parasol. They grew even quieter. Unlike the silence of many people, Sikong Lin, the vice bureau chief of the Bureau of Ceremonies, had a joyful light in his eyes. Before this, he had been very pessimistic. The fewer people on Ding Ning's side, the more cruel battles Ding Ning would encounter in the following trials. This was a simple principle. But now, things had changed. The cause of this change was Zhang Yi, who had not been noticed and was thought to be mediocre by most people. How could such a person, who was able to change the entire situation, be a mediocre and incompetent person? The fire in the stove burned brighter and the water was about to boil. At this time, students on the mountain path started to walk out. Other than Ding Ning, many of the other people were about the same. When Ku Shichuan reached the exit, many people were also near the exit. A young girl dressed in simple linen robes appeared in Su Lianhua's sight. Su Lianhua's eyes lit up. He, who was lying on his side and looking at the exit, waved his hand at the young girl without the slightest demeanor of an expert. The young girl was stunned for a moment before walking towards Su Lianhua. She directly passed through the simple and crude hut. When she walked past the gap that Zhang Yi had torn out, she couldn't help but turn her head to look at Zhang Yi again. "Why are you completely fine?" Su Lianhua sat up and asked simply as she looked at the girl in plain robes who had walked up to her. This young girl was naturally the most outstanding student of the Plain Heart Sword House, Xiaowan. Looking at the dense and crisscrossing bandages on Su Lianhua's body, Xiaowan's brows immediately furrowed, but a look of relief flashed through her eyes. "When I was choosing my sword earlier, I chose the Duobao sword from the Duobao pavilion of Dahan." She looked at Ding Ning behind Su Lianhua and Exian next to him. Then she saw the black ice worm curled up next to Ding Ning. Her eyes immediately widened. After being stunned for a few breaths, she came back to her senses and looked at Su Lianhua again to explain, "There are many arcane tools in the multi-treasure sword. The strings inside can be used to deal with the large number of strange insects inside." Su Lianhua looked up slightly at the long sword with a black hilt and indigo body on Xiaowan's back. He asked inquisitively, "Something like a horse tripping rope?" Xiaowan nodded and said, "Similar." Su Lianhua gave an honest evaluation. "Your luck is not bad." Xiaowan did not say anything else and just looked at him. "Zhang Yi is boiling water for me to drink," Su Lianhua looked at her and said. With this sentence, Xiaowan could see his meaning. Then she sat down in the empty space next to Su Lianhua and said tiredly, "Drinking something hot will make you feel better." Then, she could not shake off her natural curiosity as a young girl. She could not help but ask softly, "What is with that worm?" Ding Ning did not close his eyes to sleep. Too much rest could also slow down one's reaction, so he had to constantly adjust his body to a state that was very conducive to battle. "Actually, Xie Chongqing has a chance to come out?" While Xiaowan and Su Lianhua were talking, he did not turn his head and said softly to Xiero, "While I could not have predicted that there would be such a test after the Sword Valley sword selection, the sword he chose is very suitable for this test. He Zhaoxi has the best endurance. I even think that he will come out earlier than my senior sect brother Zhang Yi. It seems that I underestimated my senior sect brother." Ding Ning looked at Zhang Yi, who was tending to the fire, and said in a low voice, "In reality, of everyone, I am most worried about Shen Yi. If they have the same luck, Su Hashan and Nangong Tsaishu's swordsmanship and sword are more suitable than him." Xiero looked at his profile and felt inexplicably moved. While Ding Ning seemed to be absolutely calm most of the time, without any special emotions, and was as unapproachable as a frozen mountain peak, she knew that Ding Ning and Zhang Yi were the same in many ways. At this time, she was suddenly shocked, because after a person walked out of the mountain path between the cliffs, he walked straight towards Zhang Yi, who was lighting the fire and the place where she, Ding Ning, and the others were. Many students had walked out at this time, and some of them were ranked high on the talent ranking. Yet, including everyone who had walked out before, including Ding Ning, no one had an expression as relaxed as this person. This was a bone-deep relaxation and even joy. It was as though that terrifying sea of brambles was just a familiar home to this person. He seemed to have eaten lunch in a familiar home, and then strolled out of the door. This was a youth who looked smaller and thinner than Ding Ning. He wore ordinary blue robes, but he had attracted attention at the start of the trials. At this time, when he appeared in front of everyone with an unfeigned ease and even enjoyment, his figure seemed to glow and easily attracted everyone's gazes. As he walked closer, information about this person appeared in Xie Ro's mind. Dugu Bai, the son of Dugu Liangxing. Dugu Liangxing, the youngest of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. The bloodline of the Dugu family was unique. They were usually passed down to only one child, and they were weak and sickly in childhood. Their cultivation talent would only appear when they were 14 or 15 years old. The cultivation talent of the Dugu family was also unique. Not only was the speed of cultivation fast, but the people of the Dugu clan also liked some simple sword moves, and they could exert great power with them. When the Dugu family was made a marquis of Dugu Liangxing, their family power was at its peak. Yet, they did not use spirit medicines to nourish themselves. Instead, they had their most trusted family general take Dugu Bai everywhere, to all kinds of cold and hot places, and to all kinds of battlefield. According to Dugu Liangxing, this was to use primal energies of the universe, battle aura, and battle souls as medicine, and to use nature to nourish people. Dugu Bai became the first cultivation genius of the Dugu family to become strong at a young age. So before the Book of Talents came out, all the young people of Chongling, even Su Lianhua and the others, felt that the first would be Dugu Bai. Zhang Yi was also stunned. He was never a person who knew how to conceal himself, so when Dugu Bai walked to his side, he was at a loss for what to do. "What are you doing?" Dugu Bai asked curiously. He was the strongest cultivator in the history of the Dugu family at a young age, but Zhang Yi still felt that compared to people of the same age, Dugu Bai's complexion was slightly sallow, and his voice was slightly shrill. "I am boiling water." He thought inside, if the Dugu family did not have this hereditary illness, it would be even better. At the same time, he did not dare to be negligent and bowed with folded hands. Dugu Bai stilled and forgot to return the greeting. He said, "Just boiling water?" Zhang Yi was stunned. "Then Brother Zhang, please give me a cup of hot tea later." Dugu Bai smiled and bowed with folded hands. Then he passed through the hut and walked towards Ding Ning. Su Lianhua and Xiao Wan could not help but look at each other in disbelief. Both Dugu Bai's expression and his words caused them to feel that Dugu Bai was going to make the same choice as them. "You are Ding Ning." "I know I am Dugu Bai." Everyone present knew that he was Dugu Bai, but when he walked in front of Ding Ning, Dugu Bai still said this. Then, under the shocked gazes of the people on the cliff, Dugu Bai sat down in front of Ding Ning. "I have some sword moves that I do not understand. You are stronger than me in this area. I think we can discuss some things." Looking at Ding Ning, who had no intention of refusing, Dugu Bai said seriously, "Not an excuse to sit here?" Ding Ning looked at him and asked softly. Dugu Bai shook his head. "Of course not. Also, I do not need an excuse to sit here." Then he could not help but laugh. This youth, who had once been recognized as the top of the young geniuses participating in the trials, had a naive and childish smile, but also an indescribable domineering and arrogant aura. Chapter 276. Your worm is very interesting. Then his gaze landed on the black ice worm next to Ding Ning. Dugu Bai's gaze was gentle, and there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. But inexplicably, the black ice worm felt great terror. Its body unconsciously curled towards Ding Ning. Seeing the black ice worm's actions, Ding Ning's eyebrows rose slightly. This black ice worm's reaction surpassed his expectations. He started to feel that Qin Yaoyin's gift to him was worth anticipating. "I have a sword move called Peacock Green." Seeing Ding Ning slowly raise his eyebrows, Dugu Bai put away his smile and looked seriously at Ding Ning. He said, "I feel this sword move is very useful to me, very powerful, but my teacher and I cannot comprehend it." Hearing Dugu Bai's words, Su Lianhua and the others grew solemn, and then even more shocked. Dugu Bai's words were simple, but they contained astounding information. Dugu Bai actually wanted to ask Ding Ning for advice on sword move. Each generation of the Dugu family was filled with astounding geniuses. Those who could become Dugu Bai's teacher naturally had astounding cultivation and status. Dugu Bai and his teacher could not comprehend something Dugu Bai was preparing to ask Ding Ning for advice. Dugu Bai looked at Ding Ning and said, "The peacock green sword move comes from the Ming King remnant manual. Wei Liaozi cultivates this remnant manual." Wei Liaozi? Su Lianhua and the others were already very shocked. The moment they heard this name, they were even more astounded. Wei Liaozi had another name in the records of Chongling and even the entire cultivation world. Foreign Wolf King? In the past, most of the areas north of Guangzhong and outside of Guangzhong were controlled by the Fan tribes. The leader of the Fan tribes was Wei Liaozi. Wei Liaozi had been king for more than 20 years, constantly fighting against the Qin dynasty's army. He was only defeated and killed by the Qin dynasty's army a year before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne. The one who killed Wei Liaozi was the great general of the Qin dynasty's Tianliang army, Dugu Liangsheng. Dugu Liangsheng was conferred the title of Marquis because of this great merit. In many records, the Qin dynasty had not been able to settle down for more than 20 years. While most of the reason was because of the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, and the majority of the Qin dynasty's power had to be placed on fighting the three dynasties, one of the reasons that could not be ignored was that Wei Liaozi was one of the strongest cultivators in the world at that time. Although Wei Liaozi was killed by my father, it was not because his cultivation was inferior to my father's. To kill him, the Tianliang army paid a heavy price. After Wei Liaozi died, this sword manual was obtained by my father. This sword manual should be the strongest sword manual of the Dugu family. Dugu Bai looked at the shocked Su Lianhua and the others and the calm Ding Ning. His voice grew slower. "I feel that the peacock green move is very strong, but I have never been able to comprehend it. Intuition was sometimes an intangible thing, but for some people, it could be described as a unique talent. Let me see the peacock green." Ding Ning did not waste words. When Dugu Bai stopped speaking, he said quietly. Dugu Bai did not hesitate. He reached into his bosom and took out a beast's skin. The color of this beast's skin was extremely strange. It was a rare pale green color and looked very tough. However, it was full of worm-like holes. Many of the words and lines on it were worn out to the point of almost disappearing. It was obvious that it was an extremely old item. Even Zhang Yi, who was boiling water, was dazed and forgot to look at the fire. Ding Ning's pupils contracted slightly. He felt endless respect for this youth of the Dugu family. This was clearly the original copy of Dugu Bai's Wisdom King sword manual. It was related to the secrets of some of Dugu Bai's sword moves, but this youth took it out directly. But he did not hesitate in his actions. He reached out, took the beast's skin from Dugu Bai's hands, and opened it in front of him. Dugu Bai's gaze did not linger on this beast's skin that he had studied countless times. He was familiar with every word, every line, and even every hole and crease on the animal's skin. When Ding Ning lowered his head and started to look at the beast's skin, his pupils started to contract a few breaths later. A strong intuition filled his heart. He took a deep breath and started to wait silently. More and more students walked out of the shadows of the cliff. These students did not know what the beast's skin in Ding Ning's hands was, or what Ding Ning was doing. But when they saw the people sitting next to Ding Ning, they were shocked. They did not understand why Su Lianhua, Xiaowan, Exin, and even Dugu Bai were sitting quietly next to Ding Ning. These students were not the only ones who could not understand. Did you think this would happen? Pan Rui looked at the youthful figures bathed in the sunlight and turned to look at Huang Jinwei. No. Huang Jinwei shook his head and then said gently, "But I can understand the reason." Pan Rui glanced at him. Huang Jinwei said emotionally, "Because they are young, too young, they are easily impulsive." It is wrong to use the thoughts of adults to predict their actions. Also, because they are too young, even if they do something wrong, adults will not punish them too harshly. Even if children did something wrong, they would be forgiven more easily than adults. Children had the right to be impudent. But even so, could this wine shop youth win? Pan Rui looked at Ding Ning's figure in the distance, and did not understand her own emotions. Gurgling noises could be heard from the pot. The water was boiling. Zhang Yi opened the lid, and used the boiling water to scald the porcelain bowls on the stove. Then he started to serve water to everyone. Please have tea. When he handed a bowl of hot water to Dugubai, Zhang Yi bowed slightly with true gratitude. In his mind, any action that could help his little sect brother was worthy of his thanks. But when he saw the clear water without even a single tea leaf, he felt that he had used the wrong words and said bashfully, "Please have some water." Dugubai smiled and took the bowl Zhang Yi handed over. He was about to speak. At this time, his smile froze slightly. Ding Ning, who had been looking down at the sword manual, looked up. Ding Ning looked up into the distance at the shadows on the cliff. Everyone was unconsciously led by his gaze and looked in that direction. Zhang Yi turned around and saw the person walking out of the cliff. His eyes filled with joy and he could not help but shout, "Nangong Kai Shu." At this time, half of the girl's body was dyed red with blood, and her hair was messy. She looked like she was having a hard time walking. However, when she heard Zhang Yi's cry of surprise, she also exclaimed in surprise. Her body seemed to be filled with strength, and with a stride, she actually jumped up. Dugubai knew that this young girl was Nangong Kaishu of the Green Vine Sword Academy. He understood the joy of Zhang Yi and the others, but felt some disappointment. But at this time, Ding Ning's voice reached their ears. "I know the crux of the problem." A wave of heavy breathing sounded. Everyone around Ding Ning looked back at him. Even Dugu by himself felt that his expression was very stiff. He could not help but say, "You know the root of the problem?" Ding Ning handed back the green beast skin and nodded. He said, "Let me see your sword." Dugubai took a deep breath. He took the beast skin with his left hand and put it into his bosom. Then he pulled out his sword with his right hand. A beautiful light green color appeared in everyone's eyes. A long sword as thin as a cicada's wing appeared in Dugubai's hand. The hilt was a faint yellow, the blade was a faint green. It was so thin it was half transparent. There were many seal scripts carved on the surface that seemed to penetrate the half-transparent blade. The entire sword was like a dragonfly's wing. This sword was Wei Liaozi's sword in the past. Wei Liaozi used this sword to fight against his enemies. Dugubai took another deep breath. Then he looked at Ding Ning and said, "I did not choose any other sword in the Sword Valley." Before Nangong Kaishu passed through the hut in front of them, before Su Lianhua and the others could ponder the meaning of Dugubai's words, Ding Ning looked at Dugubai and said calmly, "So your father and the generals of the Tianliang army should not have seen Wei Liaozi use the peacock green sword move?" Dugubai's body shook. He looked solemnly at Ding Ning, nodded and said, "Yes." Su Lianhua and the others had disbelief in their eyes again. Of course, Ding Ning could not have seen the battle back then. There was only one possibility for him to say something so certain. He had seen the crux of this sword move. The air seemed to freeze. Dugubai looked at Ding Ning and said, "Is it a problem with the sword?" Ding Ning shook his head and said, "It is a problem with many swords." Chapter 277. The Problem of Many Swords? Dugubai suddenly realized something and his face paled. Ding Ning glanced at him and did not speak. Dugubai looked at Ding Ning and could not help but repeat, "Is it really the problem of many swords?" Ding Ning still did not speak, just looked at him and nodded seriously. The two's conversation seemed to be in riddles, but everyone present could hear the meaning. "Is it not a sword form that can be used with one sword?" Xia Wan unconsciously said. Ding Ning nodded again. "There are many sword forms that cannot be used with one sword. But this sword form is very special, and cannot be used with two swords. Dugu Bai also looked up and said with difficulty, "Does it require many swords?" Su Lianhua understood but found it inconceivable. "How do you use many swords?" Ding Ning looked calmly at everyone and said softly, "A sword form that requires many swords to be used. First, this person's hand must be very fast, and they may not have many swords in their hand. When they make this move, they may allow this sword to fly out, and their hand may have already grasped another sword." Everyone was shocked speechless as they thought about that scene. A hint of bitterness appeared at the corners of Dugu Bai's mouth. He said in a trembling voice, "Peacock green, only peacocks will be completely green when they spread their tails. So this sword form is not much different from throwing many swords?" Ding Ning said, "There is not much difference." Dugu Bai said dazedly, "How did you think of it, and so quickly? Obstacles to knowledge often come from fixed thinking. Almost all sword manuals pursue absolute control of the sword. The sword is like a person's arm and cannot be let go. But some sword forms are different. When you feel you cannot understand, you can try to think in a different way. Do not think about whether it is reasonable or not. First get the result, then think about how to approach this result, and think of possible ways to reach this result," Ding Ning said calmly. The depths of Dugu Bai's eyes went blank for a moment before they brightened, becoming as bright as stars. His mind became even brighter. Many swords rose up at the same time. Many swords flew out along different paths, as beautiful as peacocks spreading their tails. His vision seemed to be filled with a beautiful patch of green. The problems that had troubled him for many years were suddenly solved. He comprehended the peacock green form. Great shock retreated from his eyes like a tide, and then turned into admiration. "Thank you for your guidance." He stood and bowed deeply to Ding Ning. Everyone noticed his choice of words. At the start, he had said discussion. Now, he was speaking of guidance. People of the same generation discuss. Only when a teacher taught a junior would he speak of guidance. Dugu Bai was facing Ding Ning like he was facing his teacher, but the surrounding people did not feel anything was wrong. "You should be first in this sword trial," Dugu Bai continued. "Is this sword understood?" Zhang Yi looked at Dugu Bai and said. He was the only person in the crowd who did not feel too shocked. He only felt happy. He even subconsciously felt that it was normal for his junior brother to be able to comprehend the profundity of this sword. At this time, he only suspected that Dugu Bai had not truly practiced it, and that there would be problems with his final judgment based on imagination. "Understood," Dugu Bai answered seriously. Then he walked forward and took down several pieces of wood from the hut in front. He sat down again below Ding Ning, and then started to use the longsword that was like a dragonfly's wing to cut the wood to make a wooden sword. Many people in the distance could not hear the conversation between Dugu Bai and Ding Ning. They did not know what had happened, and did not know what Dugu Bai was doing. But they saw Dugu Bai bow to Ding Ning and sit below him. These people who had been shocked by Exin, Su Lianhua, Dugu Bai and the others sitting next to Ding Ning were even more shocked. Nangong Kaishu walked through the hut to Ding Ning's side and then sat down. The left side of her robe was dyed red with blood. But before Zhang Yi could go forward to ask about her wounds, she said simply to Zhang Yi, "I am fine." Seeing her sit down next to him, Ding Ning nodded and did not speak. Nangong Tsaishu's bravery and Ding Ning's calmness caused many people in the distance to feel restless. "Who are you looking at?" Su Lianhua frowned slightly and could not help but ask. He found that Ding Ning was looking into the distance. At the start, he thought that Ding Ning was worried about Shen Yi, Xie Chongxing, and the others who had not come out. But he gradually realized that Ding Ning's gaze was not on the cliff exit most of the time, but on those who had come out and were resting or treating their wounds. Hearing Su Lianhua's question, Ding Ning shook his head. "I do not know." Su Lianhua was shocked. "You do not know? There are not many people who can truly threaten me." Ding Ning understood his puzzlement. Still looking at the students in the distance, he explained, among those people, the only ones who can threaten me are Yi Haoran and Ku Shichuan, but not just those two. You mean that someone is hiding their true strength, and this person may be stronger than Yi Haoran and Ku Shichuan? Su Lianhua immediately understood Ding Ning's meaning. His gaze flashed. You want to find him ahead of time? Ding Ning nodded. He was more familiar than anyone with the Empress' most skilled move. So Lai Yinghong, who was ranked first on the Book of Talents, was definitely not her final strength. And this person would definitely be stronger than Lai Yinghong. If this person's sword manual was more exquisite than Lai Yinghong's, it was nothing to Ding Ning. But if this person's vital energy cultivation was far above Lai Yinghong's, and he could not find this person ahead of time, and detect this person's true strength, he would not have absolute confidence in the trials. What made his heart heavy was that up until now, he had not discovered who this person was. Who was that person? Su Lianhua looked at the figures of the students in the distance, and his breathing unconsciously sped up. At this time, other than the people sitting around Ding Ning, there were 15 or 16 students who had passed. He recognized almost all of them. Most of them were not as seriously wounded as him, but they would be seriously wounded at normal times. There were only 4 who did not appear to be wounded. Other than Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran, there was a youth dressed in yellow robes, and a young woman dressed in plain robes like Xiao Wan. Song Yuming, it is not likely. At this time, Xiao Wan's voice sounded by his ear. Su Lianhua did not turn to look at Xiao Wan. He nodded, and his gaze landed on the young woman in plain robes. Song Yuming was the youth dressed in yellow robes. He was a student from the Heaven Mountain Sword School. The reason it was not likely was not just because the principal of the Heaven Mountain Sword School, Mao Ruoshang, was extremely old-fashioned. He was one of the people who had sympathized with the Bazin Kendo ground in the past, and had expressed dissatisfaction with White Goat Cave joining the Green Vine Sword Academy. Also, Song Yuming's father was the Guangyang general of Guangyang Commandery, Song Qiansong. A person of Song Qiansong's position would not allow his son to be controlled by someone else, even if that person was the mistress of Chongling. Song Yuming was not likely. Then was it the young woman dressed in plain robes, Su Xin? A female cultivator from the Sky Snow Taoist Monastery? The Sky Snow Taoist Monastery was a cultivation place that did not participate in court matters. They took in few disciples, and no matter what level the disciples reached, they would stay in the monastery for their entire lives, detached from the world. Was this female cultivator like He Shanjian, who had just been killed by Bailey Sushua, unable to endure loneliness? Su Lianhua's brow furrowed deeply. At this time, Xiao Wan's cry of joy sounded. Su Lianhua turned his head. His eyes were filled with joy. Because at this moment, a very familiar figure walked out of the mountain path between the cliffs. Chun Liqiu, dressed in white robes, walked out. Chun Liqiu, him, and Xiao Wan were good friends. Li Chou and Lianhua. Su Lianhua had fantasized many times that many years later, his name and this good friend's name might be connected together and become a legend. Just like how Zhang Yi had been worried about the safety of Shen Yi and the others, he and Xiao Wan had been worried about Chun Liqiu's safety. But in a breath, the joy in Su Lianhua's eyes quickly faded. His face also stiffened slightly. He saw Chun Liqiu pause. Just this pause, when he exchanged a look with Chun Liqiu from the distance, he sensed Chun Liqiu's intentions. Xiao Wan also felt it, and her lips started to tremble slightly. Chun Liqiu started to walk again. He silently passed through the hut, and walked through the large hole that Zhang Yi and Dugu Bai had made by tearing down the wooden plank. He walked in front of Su Lianhua and Xiao Wan, but stopped 10 feet away. Su Lianhua did not look at Chun Liqiu. He looked silently at the ground 10 feet in front of him. Any words at this time would be awkward and displeased. Sometimes, you have to lower your head to bear the crown. Chun Liqiu spoke, but he did not speak to Su Lianhua and Xiaowan. He looked at Ding Ning and said seriously in a low voice. Ding Ning had been calmly looking at Chun Liqiu's arrival. Hearing the words, his expression did not change. He looked up slightly and said seriously, I only know that if I lower my head, I will not see the sword falling from above. The more I lower my head, the more my head will be cut off. Chapter 278. Chun Liqiu bowed slightly to show his respect to Ding Ning, and then turned to look at Su Lianhua and Xiaowan. I do not want you to be with him. He was silent for a moment and said, This is an unwise action. Su Lianhua looked at his good friend's face dyed gold by the sunlight, and a self-deprecating smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Then he lowered his head. For him, sometimes he lowered his head because he did not want others to see his disappointment and sadness. People will always do unwise things in their lives, because many things are more important than intelligence and reason, like friendship. Su Lianhua lowered his head and said slowly. The breeze in the valley blew on Chun Liqiu's body. The early summer breeze was warm, but Chun Liqiu felt slightly cold. He and Su Lianhua had known each other for a long time, so he could hear the meaning in Su Lianhua's words. If Chun Liqiu was not Ding Ning, but a disciple of White Goat Cave, Su Lianhua would sit next to Chun Liqiu out of friendship. But now, he was not willing to sit next to Su Lianhua, so their friendship was gone. Chun Liqiu's mouth tasted slightly bitter. He could not persuade Su Lianhua. After taking a deep breath, he turned to look at Su Lianhua. But Xiaowan turned her head and avoided his gaze. Chun Liqiu got his answer. He was slightly sad, but he did not think his choice was wrong. In his view, friendship could be chosen. He could choose a bright future. Why did he choose to walk down an increasingly narrow path with some people? He turned silently and prepared to pass through the hut to the other side. Do you want to drink hot water? At this time, a slightly restrained but polite voice reached his ears. His eyebrows rose and he looked towards the voice. He saw Zhang Yi holding a bowl of hot water and looking sincerely at him. Chun Liqiu looked into Zhang Yi's eyes. Zhang Yi's gaze was sincere. I cannot understand. Chun Liqiu did not take the bowl from Zhang Yi's hand and turned to leave. He said softly with a self-deprecating smile, Who would be willing to die for a bowl of hot water? Hearing his words, Su Lianhua remained silent. He believed that Chun Liqiu was right. However, there were some things that only concerned people's feelings and had nothing to do with right or wrong. Could it be him? When Chun Liqiu turned to leave, Xiaowan had already turned to look at his back. Now that Chun Liqiu was far away, she spoke softly. I won't. Just now, Dugubai, who had been seriously sharpening the wooden sword and hadn't even glanced at Chun Liqiu, answered her question with certainty. If this is the last chess piece she buried, Chun Liqiu wouldn't have specially said these words. Xiaowan took a sip of hot water. Originally, when a person had been hungry for a long time, even drinking this kind of pure water would have a sweet taste. However, at this moment, she couldn't help but feel bitter. While she had Su Lianhua, Dugubai, and Exin, the other side had Yi Haoran, Ku Shichuan and now Chun Liqiu. 3 of the top 5 students in the Book of Talents were definitely their opponent. She knew Chun Liqiu's strength well. She knew that Chun Liqiu was much stronger than her. If this was an ordinary time, Su Lianhua and Chun Liqiu might not be able to win. But now, Su Lianhua was seriously wounded. How could he fight? There is also Lai Yinghong and that chess piece. She took a deep breath and said slowly. She didn't finish her sentence, but everyone present understood what she meant. Why has Lai Yinghong not come out yet? Nangong Kaishu, who was treating the wound on her left arm, said coldly. No one knew that Lai Yinghong could not come out because of Shen Yi and Xie Chongsheng. In everyone's view, while Lai Yinghong had not appeared, it was only a matter of time. At this time, there were 16 or 17 students on the other side of the hut. In terms of numbers and ranking on the Book of Talents, they were at an absolute disadvantage. Chen Lichio's footsteps grew distant. The hut quieted again, so quiet that it was slightly unsettling. Actually, it is not so complicated. Ding Ning likes silence, but he did not like to make the people around him feel uneasy. So he said calmly, with so many people, the chances of winning in the end are very high. Everyone's eyes were focused on him. Even Dugu Bai, who had been working on his 5th wooden sword, raised his head to look at him. I do not understand where your confidence lies, but I feel that people have to do some unbridled things in their lives, and do some things that they feel proud of. Exin suddenly laughed and said sincerely, while even if you fail this time, you are unbridled enough to make me proud, but I still hope that you can succeed in the end. Xia Wan did not speak, but her emotions inexplicably calmed down. She started to understand that this was because there was meaning. As long as she felt that something was meaningful, her past cultivation seemed to have meaning. Her eyes started to shine with a wondrous light. She thought that this might be the true straightforwardness described in the sword manual of the Plain Heart Sword House. Nangong Tsaishu's eyes also lit up at this time. He Zhaoxi has come out. She gave a soft exclamation of surprise. A familiar figure that looked tired but extremely muscular walked out of the mountain path between the cliffs. Fortunately, you are by my side. Otherwise, I would cry to death. Su Lianhua smiled self-deprecatingly and said to Xiaowan, Fortunately, I do not have many friends to begin with, and will not have such emotions. Dugu Bai also laughed. In their sight, He Zhaoxi, covered in blood, walked over without hesitation when he saw Ding Ning and the others. Making friends also depends on the timing, Exin added. Then he also laughed. Xiaowan's heart suddenly warmed. She could not help but laugh. She knew that she might have just lost a friend, but she would gain many true friends here. I really don't understand how they can laugh in such a situation. A youth in light blue brocade robes looked at these people's smiles from a distance and could not help but frown as he spoke to the person next to him. This youth was Zhou Wangyan, who had argued with Xie Chongqing at the start of the trials. At this time, the back of his brocade robes was covered in wounds. Some of the wounds were so deep that bones could be seen. A student behind him was bandaging his wounds. Inexplicably, compared to the wounds on his back, these people's smiles made his heart feel cold. The crude hut naturally separated the two sides. There were fewer people on Ding Ning's side compared to their side. But at this time, Ding Ning and the others were sitting quietly. Not just Zhou Wangyan, but almost everyone on their side felt that Ding Ning and the others were giving them increasing pressure. Time slowly passed, and the sky gradually darkened. At the start, the students came out one after another. The intervals between the students who came out grew longer until no one appeared for a long time. Zhang Yi's heart suddenly sank. Some cultivators in indigo robes appeared in his sight. These cultivators were coming from the mountain paths between the cliffs towards the mountain valley they were in. The cultivators of Min Mountain Sword sect were continuously appearing. In his mind, there was only one possibility: the sea of brambles ahead was about to end. At this time, he did not feel joy because Lai Yinghong had not appeared. He just thought that Shen Yi and the others had not appeared. A strange noise rang out. Most of the students in the mountain valley started to discover this reality. Su Lianhua and Xiaowan could not help but exchange a look. At this time, heavy footsteps sounded on the cliffs. It was already the end, and almost everyone's breathing became rough along with the heavy footsteps. The heavy footsteps were like the beating of war drums, reverberating in everyone's hearts. Nangong Tsaishu's eyes widened to their limits. She saw that figure with everyone else, but because she was the most familiar with that person, she was the first to cry out involuntarily, Su Hashan? Gasps of disbelief sounded. Nangong Kaishu was not wrong. The one who walked out was not Lai Yinghong, but Su Hashan. Why is it like this? Zhou Wangyan could not help but shout. Everyone knew that Lai Yinghong, ranked first on the Book of Talents, was very strong, and Su Hashan was a negligible existence to them. Many students near him frowned deeply. Su Hashan was on Ding Ning's side. At this time, even if there was one more person on Ding Ning's side, the air around them would grow heavier. But at this time, all the sound suddenly disappeared. Su Hashan seemed to hear Nangong Tsaishu shout and suddenly stopped. When his figure stopped, Su Hashan looked up. He looked towards where Nangong Kaishu and Ding Ning were. He opened his mouth, wanting to speak, but no sound came out. A mouthful of blood surged out of his mouth. As the blood surged out of his mouth, everyone saw that his hands had been pressing hard against his abdomen. Blood continued to flow from the gaps between his fingers. At this time, he seemed to have used up all his strength. His hands could not hold and let go. As his hands loosened, a stream of blood mixed with intestines flowed out of the wound on his abdomen. Everyone held their breath. Nangong Tsaishu's body froze, and her face turned pale. A streak of sword light fell from the sky. The moment Su Hashan fell on his back, it had already reached his side. The sword light flashed and Su Hashan's figure disappeared from everyone's sight. But the scene in that moment was deeply imprinted in everyone's mind. Before entering the Sea of Brambles, Gung Ren had said that this would be extremely difficult, and there was the danger of their intestines being pierced. Yet no one had expected such a thing to happen. Even though such an injury might not be fatal, this scene was unbearable for many young students like them. Zhou Wangyan's body uncontrollably trembled violently. Maybe this is the result of standing on his side. His voice was trembling as he muttered to himself in a chilling tone. Chapter 279. Zhang Yi looked at the pool of warm blood in the distance, and unconsciously walked forward in pain. He instinctively wanted to ask the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators dressed in green jade robes if Su Hashan's life was in danger. Ding Ning frowned slightly. He thought back to every detail of that scene and then looked up at Zhang Yi. He shook his head and said, "Do not go over. Su Hashan will not die." Zhang Yi had always believed in his words, so his footsteps naturally stopped. If it was a fatal wound, the people of Min Mountain Sword Sect would have started to treat him long ago and would not have let him walk out like this. He was so seriously wounded and was able to survive. This is his pride. "You should also be proud," Su Lianhua said slowly with narrowed eyes. Nangong Kaishu bowed her head. She felt that Su Lianhua spoke the truth. But when such a scene happened to her good friend, she still felt very cold. Xiero was also very cold. Multiple cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect had entered the valley. If Su Hashan was really the last to pass, then this meant that Shen Yi and Xie Chongxing were trapped in the Sea of Brambles and would not appear here again. The entire valley returned to silence. A Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator dressed in green jade robes walked out of the mountain path. Under the light of the setting sun, his long shadow fell on the mountain path behind him, giving people the feeling of a black and long door sealing the mountain path. Suddenly, all the students in the valley sensed something unusual and looked up. Many cultivators appeared on the mountain path high up in the cliff. Through the different attire of the cultivators, the students could easily judge that these were teachers and court officials from various cultivation places. The teachers of these cultivation places and the officials of the imperial court would also enter this valley. While they did not know why these teachers and court officials were allowed to enter the valley to observe from a close distance, all these signs caused most students to sink into deep shock. The previous test had really ended. Su Hashan was the last examinee to pass the Sea of Brambles. Then where did Li Yinghong, first on the Book of Talents, go? At this moment, a young girl appeared on the cliff. Following a breeze that blew through the cliff, she didn't seem to think and directly stepped down from the cliff. Her green jade-colored robe swayed gently like a lotus leaf. her figure passed by many masters of various cultivation places, who were still walking on the mountain path in the air, and floated down into the valley without any smoke or fire. Looking at this young woman whose eyes contained great confidence and authority, most students felt a mountainous pressure. At the same time, their last thread of uncertainty disappeared. Even in Min Mountain Sword Sect, among all the direct disciples of Min Mountain Sword Sect, there was only one such young woman who could disregard the feelings of others and almost rudely bypass all the teachers of the cultivation places. She even had such presence in front of other Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators who were older than her. She could only be Jing Liuli. Even Jing Liuli had appeared. The previous test had naturally ended. Other than Ding Ning and a few others, the other students had never seen this legendary young woman before. Seeing Jing Liuli appear in front of them, these students had complicated gazes. Admiration, awe, jealousy, many different lights appeared in their eyes. Jing Liuli's gaze was calm. Even as she landed, she still had a lofty pride. She had the right to be proud. At least, in terms of entering Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, everyone in the valley was still catching up to her steps from many years ago. It is over. Without any opening or self-introduction, Jing Liuli's gaze swept across all the students in the valley, and then she said simply. She did not cause any ambiguity. After she said these 3 words, she continued to speak without any pause. Next is the final sword test. In 5 minutes, you will compete according to the results of the draw. In this time, you are not allowed to receive any outside treatment. After the competition starts, you are not allowed to speak with the spectators. Jing Liuli's description of the rules of the final test was unusually simple. After saying these words, she walked towards the crude huts that separated the 2 camps. In the growing dusk, her figure appeared more and more otherworldly, and seemed to have some kind of indescribable magic, which made many people feel that her walking towards the huts that separated the 2 sides contained some kind of profound behavior. Su Lianhua's gaze passed Jing Liuli's figure and landed on the cultivation teachers who had entered the valley. As these cultivators of different methods and sword manuals entered, the primal energies of the universe in the mountain valley seemed to become chaotic, and his emotions became troubled. His brow furrowed deeply, and he asked in a soft but cold voice, "What is her intention?" She only said 3 sentences about the rules. She was not even willing to mention the one-on-one competition. But in reality, of the 3 sentences, the most important is the last one. She wants to give some people a chance to speak. Hearing his words, Ding Ning turned his head and said calmly, "Or rather, Min Mountain Sword Sect wants to give some people a chance to speak and see how some people will behave. Not allowing the spectators to speak after the competition starts means that she is allowing people to speak at this time." Su Lianhua's brow was still furrowed. He could not completely understand. Something must have happened in Min Mountain Sword Sect. Ding Ning looked towards the distant cliffs and said slowly, "But we cannot see it. Some people really know how to seize the time." Then he could not help but mock, a scornful sneer at the corner of his mouth. Some of the cultivation teachers were still walking on the mountain path and had not truly stepped into the valley. But at this time, a middle-aged man in yellow robes walked out of the crowd and quickly walked over. Everyone's gazes gathered on this middle-aged man in yellow robes. Everyone was certain who this middle-aged man in yellow robes was going to get close to. Jing Liuli, standing in the crude hut with her hands behind her back, showed a hint of disdain. Yet, she only watched silently and did not stop this middle-aged man in yellow robes. "I do not know what that person has to say." Nangong Kaishu looked at the middle-aged man in yellow robes who was quickly walking closer, and said with a cold expression. Her personality was one that hated evil. She knew that this middle-aged man in yellow robes was the attendant of Palace Attendant Rong. In her view, Shui Wangshu was dead, and Palace Attendant Rong had personally acted on the mountain path. Palace attendant Rong should not have the face to send someone to say anything. Also, there was no meaning in saying anything. Her voice was not low. The middle-aged man in yellow robes had vital energy cultivation far above her and heard her clearly. But his expression was calm, and even had a natural deference. After passing by the crude hut, the middle-aged man in yellow robes stopped and bowed respectfully to Ding Ning. "I do not know your final decision." Then, this yellow-robed middle-aged man opened his mouth and said calmly and clearly, "However, before you make your final decision, I hope that you will seriously consider it, because you should understand that you are not only rejecting some people's futures, you are also rejecting a person's sincere friendship." Su Lianhua, Zhang Yi and the others stilled slightly. They did not immediately understand the meaning of the middle-aged man in yellow robe's words. Ding Ning raised his head and looked up the mountain again. He knew that someone was looking at him from up high, but he could not see the other. Just this action caused Su Lianhua and the others to understand that the middle-aged man in yellow robes was speaking of Crown Prince Fu Su. Despicable. Su Lianhua suddenly became angry and couldn't help but curse out loud. At the side, Dugu Bai smiled self-deprecatingly. In the hands of the truly powerful, anything could be used as a means to defeat the enemy. Compared to the truly powerful, individual cultivators were too insignificant. Maybe it is not hard for you to enter the top 10, but it is too difficult for you to win. The middle-aged man in yellow robes looked at Ding Ning, who had not responded, and then turned to look at the students on the other side of the hut. He said in a sincere tone, "You only have a few people, and the other side is many times your number. If one of you is defeated in one round, then most of the people in front of you will be enemies who will fight to the death. If you are fated to not win, do not reject the good intentions of some people." Hearing the middle-aged man's words, Ding Ning's expression remained calm. He shook his head and said, "If they are true friends, they will still think of me as a friend after their good intentions are rejected." The middle-aged man in yellow robes did not speak, bowed and left. Ding Ning's calmness caused Su Lianhua and the others to quickly calm down. They looked at the students in the distance and knew that the middle-aged man in yellow robes' words were not unreasonable. At a glance, there were 37 students standing in the distance. This was 4 times their number. If the first round passed, and they had more people eliminated, then only 2 or 3 of the remaining 20 students would be on their side. They were indeed very weak and powerless. But at this time, the middle-aged man in yellow robes suddenly paused. At this time, a person slowly walked out from the students in front of him and walked towards Ding Ning and the others. That person seemed to be afraid of the cold, and wore thicker robes than ordinary people. Su Lianhua, Xia Wan and the others looked in shock at this person's figure. Li Shixing. Chapter 280. Li Shixing, who was silent and bold, cunning and careful, slowly walked over in robes much thicker than the other students. He gave off the feeling of a lone wolf. He was not famous in Chongling. Up until now, most of the students at the trials did not know his identity, and even thought that he was a person from the border. But Su Lianhua and Xia Wan naturally knew Li Shixing's identity. Because Li Shixing was too silent and inconspicuous, when Li Shixing walked over from the crowd, she realized just now she had overlooked the existence of such an expert. In these years, Li Shixing had not been in Chongling, and no one had seen him leave. But before he had been exiled to the Yuezhi country, Li Shixing had always been one of the best among his peers. If she faced Li Shixing alone, she did not have much confidence in winning. She could not understand the meaning of Li Shixing's actions. Ding Ning had never seen Li Shixing before, and did not know that Fu Su had once stopped Li Shixing from meeting him. But when he heard Su Lianhua and Xia Wan say this person's name, he immediately knew this person's identity. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not speak as he looked at Li Shixing walking over. Li Shixing also did not speak. He walked until he was next to Ding Ning, Su Lianhua and the others, and then sat down on an empty spot. Su Lianhua frowned and was about to speak, but this situation did not seem to be an obstacle for a gentleman like Zhang Yi. Looking at Li Shixing, who sat down, Zhang Yi bowed gratefully and shyly. He asked softly, "You also want to help my junior sect brother Ding Ning?" Li Shixing still did not speak. He did not return the bow and just nodded. Why? Xiaowan looked at Li Shixing and was still suspicious. Dugu Bai's breathing unconsciously paused. He had left Chongling when he was young, and did not have many interactions with Li Shixing. But he had heard some rumors about Li Shixing. He felt that people like Li Shixing were very fragile, and Xiaowan's attitude would cause many bad consequences. As Dugu Bai had expected, he saw strong enmity rise in Li Shixing's eyes. Yet to Dugu Bai's surprise, Li Shixing did not express anything. He slowly turned his head and looked at Ding Ning. "My father wishes for me to deal with you." Hearing his first words, Su Lianhua, Zhang Yi, and the others were stunned. "That's why I didn't come over at first," Li Shixing continued. "I like people with principles. Many times in Chongling, one must obey, but I do not like to obey. My principle is to follow my heart. Just like Duanmu Jingzong that day. Everyone thought I should not hit him, and did not allow me to hit him, but I still broke 2 of his ribs. Just now that I've heard your conversation with that person, I'm sure that you're not willing to comply, so I came over. What's more, there are already many swords that want to deal with you. There's no point in adding another sword like me." These words sounded particularly strange. Or rather, the reason was very strange. At the side, Exin could not help but frown. But inexplicably, for a person like Li Shixing, such a reason sounded very convincing. Ding Ning looked at Li Shixing and did not ask any other questions. He said seriously, "You just returned to Chongling not long ago." Everyone reacted and looked at Li Shixing in a different light. Ding Ning's words pointed out the likely result of Li Shixing's actions. He would be exiled again. Li Shixing was silent for a moment and said, "Chongling may not be as good as the Yuezhi, at least in my eyes." Hearing his answer, Dugu Bai's frown eased, and he felt some respect. "Well said." Su Lianhua stopped looking at Li Shixing and turned to look at the distant students. He looked at Chun Liqiu's figure that was about to disappear into the darkness and said with slight disdain, "What obedience? When people live in the world, the most important thing is to be happy. If one is not happy when they have power in cultivation, what is the point of cultivation?" Zhang Yi relaxed completely, and felt even more admiration for Li Shixing. He bowed again and said, "Many thanks. Do not thank me." Li Shixing said coldly, "Even if I stand on your side now, I may not be helping you because Duanmu Jingzong became a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect many years ago." Su Lianhua, Dugu Bai and the others exchanged a look. They all knew this was the truth. Duanmu Jingzong of the Duanmu Marquisate establishment had passed Min Mountain Sword Sect's exam a few years ago, and had been cultivating in Min Mountain Sword Sect for many years. But they had not thought of this at the moment. Zhang Yi stilled. "You mean you feel that because of your help, even if my junior sect brother Ding Ning wins and enters Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, Duanmu Jingzong will take revenge on my junior sect brother because of you? You may feel that it is impossible." Li Shixing did not look at Zhang Yi, and looked coldly into the distance. But Duanmu Jingzong is such a person. Li Shixing was not good at chatting. In both expression and tone, he gave people a feeling of being unreasonable and unapproachable. But Zhang Yi did not seem to think so. In his eyes, Li Shixing was his friend. Since they were friends, he could tolerate him. He could not help but ask curiously, "I heard that when you broke Duanmu Jingzong's ribs, he was only 5 years old. Why do you have such a conclusion?" 5 years old? Li Shixing could not help but sneer. "So you probably would not have thought that a 5-year-old child would be so sinister and vicious. Just because he did not like someone, He would often do some evil things and then lie to frame that person. He would often put some dirty things in that person's water, and even set up some tricks on the stairs to make people fall and break their limbs. Everyone stilled. Even Ding Ning stilled. Zhang Yi's limbs unconsciously grew cold. After a long pause, he looked in disbelief at Li Shixing and said in a trembling voice, "You say that when Duanmu Jingzong was 5 years old, he schemed to harm you in every way?" Li Shixing did not answer. He was not skilled at conversing with people, so he felt that he did not need to answer. "So you broke his ribs that time, not because of a temporary conflict, but because he had done many things like this before. You have tolerated him for a long time?" Zhang Yi started to understand. His body trembled slightly. He started to feel that if this was true, then his exile for so many years was unfair to Li Shixing. Li Shixing was silent for a moment. "If that was the case, I might not have been so heavy-handed." Suddenly, he raised his head and said angrily, "I raised a dog, a puppy that was abandoned when it could drink milk. But when the dog finally grew a little, and I finally didn't have to feed it goat milk anymore, and it could follow me everywhere, it floated in the well as a corpse." Ding Ning's gaze flashed slightly. Su Lianhua, Xia Wan and the others could not help but take a deep breath and look at each other. Zhang Yi's face paled. Duanmu Jingzong threw him into the well? It is hard for a child to do things without leaving traces. It is not hard to find out. Many people can easily find out, even my father knows that it was Duanmu Jingzong who did it. So he asked me not to do anything out of line. But because it was done by someone of Duanmu Jingzong's background, father warned me. Li Shixing laughed harshly. The Duanmu family also gave me an even cuter dog, but they did not know. This made me even more certain that it was Duanmu Jingzong. I promised all of them, but I did not want to obey. So I broke Duanmu Jingzong's ribs. If not for the fact that I was too young, and did not have enough strength, Duanmu Jingzong would have died. Li Shixing's eyes flashed with an indescribable bitterness. He took a deep breath and said, "Because at the time, I did not just want to break his ribs, I wanted to kill him. Wanting a person to pay with their life because of a little dog. This was indeed too ruthless." However, when it happened to a 6-year-old and a 5-year-old, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. At least, even Zhang Yi could not judge if Li Shixing was right or wrong. He just felt that Duanmu Jingzong should not have done this. This should not have happened in the first place. To that woman, "You are like a dog. I am just like a dog that can be crushed to death or thrown into the well. But even if I die, I do not want them to be so happy." Li Shixing did not know why he had said so much today, why he was so angry at the old matters he had almost forgotten. But he felt exceptionally happy inside. His chest was so hot it seemed to burn. Ding Ning turned to look at him and laughed. "Then let's fight." He laughed and then stood up. In this moment, everyone around him seemed to have a fire burning in their chests. Chapter 281. The setting sun was about to disappear into the distant horizon. At this time, the clouds in the sky were so red they looked like they were about to burn. All the students, even those who were seriously injured, struggled to stand up because the final sword test was about to start. Xiero looked at the side of Ding Ning's face. She saw Ding Ning's eyes light up, and the sky around him darkening. She looked down and saw her shadow was like a faint wing behind Ding Ning's shadow. She increasingly felt that she was not a person of Ding Ning's world. But at this time, she felt that even if she was just a small invisible wing behind Ding Ning, she would do all she could. Every person has a stage in their life where they do not accept their fate and do not accept it. Palace attendant Rong walked out of the resting tent and passed by the middle-aged man in yellow robes who was standing respectfully with his head bowed. She looked at the distant clouds and said coldly, "I am only teaching them that people must accept their fate." Mountains have natural heights, much less people. Those naturally short mountains want to compete with the tall mountains. Other than wasting effort, they will make themselves and others unhappy. Being exiled for a dog represents justice in the eyes of children, but stupidity in the eyes of adults. The middle-aged man in yellow robes listened silently to palace attendant Rong's words. There was no discontent or opposition in his eyes. He felt that palace attendant Rong was speaking the truth. He had also had a stage in his life where he did not accept his fate, but now, he accepted his fate. If people accepted their fate, they would not feel much unwillingness. But the hardest thing in life was to accept fate. Among the many officials who had entered the mountain valley, Sikong Lin, the vice bureau chief of the Bureau of Ceremonies, looked at Ding Ning and the others who had stood up. His eyes gradually lit up. Yantai Guanjian silently appeared behind Jing Liuli. The last sword test this time will be the most exciting and intense of all the tests in the past. Looking at the students standing silently on the two sides of the hut, Yantai Guanjian shook his head and said softly with emotion. Jing Liuli nodded in agreement. But she did not feel any pride. The main reason was that the youth from the alley and low-level cultivation place was not willing to accept his fate. Qing Dong is here. An abrupt and cold shout rang out in the valley. The student who heard his name shook and looked at the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator dressed in green jade robes who had spoken coldly. I'm ashamed of Zhong. Only when this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator's voice sounded did this student and the surrounding people react. The final competition had started without any opening remark. This isn't fair. The moment he reacted, the first student whose name was mentioned shouted in a daze. Many people felt the same way. This student called Qing Donglai came from the secret Stone Dao School and was ranked 41st on the Book of Talent. His opponent, Zhong Kue, came from Jingyan Sword School and was ranked 21st on the Book of Talent. There was a large difference in cultivation between the two, especially since Qing Donglai's left thigh had a serious penetrating wound. It was difficult for him to move, and intense movements could cause him to bleed profusely. On the other hand, Zhong Kue only had light wounds. How is it unfair? Hearing Qing Donglai's dazed shout, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who announced the matchups looked expressionlessly at him and said slowly, the matchups were randomly selected. The difference in cultivation is a problem of daily cultivation. The wounds on your body are the remnants of the previous event. Do you feel that the trials only have the last event, and the previous events do not count? If you feel it is unfair, you can forfeit. After a pause, this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator added emotionlessly. The student called Qing Donglai's face was as white as snow. But hearing these words, he could not speak, and did not dare to say anything in response. The other students could only maintain their silence. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator had randomly selected such a matchup. Naturally, there were many areas worth considering and questioning, especially now that there were 45 students who had passed the previous events. In these 2-on-2 matches, one person would have one less fight and would have a great advantage. But this was Min Mountain Sword Sect's sword trials. These were the rules of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Just like this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator said, if one felt it was unfair, there was no other way but to withdraw. Sun Changji against Sing Kaitian. Nie Yen against Mou. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who announced the matchups had no interest in looking at the expressions of Qing Donglai and the others. He continued to speak slowly. Hearing his announcement, all the students had different expressions and reactions. Some were calm, some sneered silently, some forced smiles, and some were ashen. Some attentive students found that there were 8 areas in the mountain valley marked out by the sword mark. Huang Jinlian against Xiero. Just as these students had expected, after the 8th group was announced, this expressionless Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator paused and then casually pointed at the 8 sides of the field, indicating that the two sides whose names were announced could enter now. Following the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator's gesture, almost all the students looked at Xiero. The reason was simple. While everyone wanted to see Ding Ning fight, in the first batch of 16, Xiero was the only cultivator standing next to Ding Ning on the other side of the crude hut. Su Lianhua and the others had grave gazes. Huang Jinlian was ranked 17th on the Book of Talent. Xiero did not cultivate in Chongling to begin with, so she did not have a ranking on the Book of Talent. In the eyes of most students, she was the same as Xie Chongsheng. She had relied on the wealth of the Xie family and used some dishonorable method to qualify to attend the Min Mountain Sword trials. Xiero had not expected that she would be the first cultivator to fight. Under everyone's gazes, she started to become nervous. Her right hand holding her sword started to tremble. The black longsword in her hand also started to tremble. Looking at her black sword that looked no different from the ordinary longswords of the Qin dynasty, most students felt that she had no chance of winning. But no one noticed that not far behind Huang Jinlian, a cultivation teacher dressed in the same robes as Huang Jinlian suddenly changed expression. Of course, he could not have predicted that Huang Jinlian would face Xiero, but he remembered some scenes in the Sea of Brambles. He opened his mouth and could not help but speak. But at this moment, a Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator appeared in front of him. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator came from the side and had his back to him. Yet this cultivator who wanted to warn Huang Jinlian suddenly realized something and closed his mouth with a pale face. The trials had started. Based on the rules Jing Liuli had spoken of, he could not say anything to warn now. Xiero took a deep breath and prepared to fight. Ding Ning's expression was calm as he nodded at her. It was just a simple action, but Xiero suddenly gained a lot of confidence. Her hand holding her sword no longer trembled. Huang Jinlian was already walking towards the area marked by the sword marks. He was tall, his expression cold, and his gaze steady as he looked forward. He gave off the feeling of a military general. The Steel Screen Sword School, he cultivated and liked to send students to the battlefield to cultivate. According to some accurate information, Huang Jinlian and some students of the Steel Screen Sword School had participated in some of the battles before the Deer Mountain Conference when the Qin dynasty took back Yangshan Commandery. Compared to Xiero, he had been very confident from the start. So he did not even look back at his teacher, and did not detect a Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator standing in front of his teacher. He had the style of a Chongling cultivator. He did not walk towards the area closest to him, but the area closest to Xiero. Please. When Xiero stopped in front of him, he pulled out his sword and held it across his chest, nodding in greeting. At this time, the other two sides were mostly in position. But because this battle had special meaning, most people's gazes gathered on him and Xiero. The sky was darkening. No one from Min Mountain Sword Sect seemed to have any intentions of lighting a fire. Yet when Huang Jinlian drew his sword and held it across his chest, the area dozens of feet around him lit up. Huang Jinlian's longsword was completely gold. The golden light was tangible, and the seal scripts on the blade formed 7 blinding spots of light as his vital energy surged. This sword was the 7 Planets Sword. The sword of the sect master of the famed 7 Planets Palace of the Han. A good sword that had fallen into the Sword Valley of Min Mountain Sword Sect, and had been chosen by Huang Jinlian in the trials. Please. Xiero also held her sword. The black sword in her hand became even dimmer under the dazzling sword light of her opponent. Yet for some reason, Huang Jinlian's eyelids unconsciously twitched as he sensed an indescribable presence of danger. Chapter 282. This dim black sword started to tremble slightly. This time, it was not because of Xiero's nervousness, but because her vital energy was starting to surge towards the black sword. Huang Jinlian's pupils constricted rapidly. He did not see any vital energy flowing on the surface of the black sword. Xie Rou's vital energy flowed into the black sword through the hilt. At the same time, he saw purple mist start to rise from the tip of the black sword. Countless needle-like purple mist erupted from the tip of the black sword at astounding speed. In a flash, a purple mist formed in front of him. Xie Rou's figure disappeared behind the purple mist. A fierce shout came out of his mouth. His seven luminaries' sword was still held horizontally in front of his chest as he pushed it forward. The seven balls of light on the sword connected together to form a moving wall of light in front of him. This was the famous defensive sword form of the Iron Screen Sword School, Hengshan Break. When Xie Rou's vital energy flooded into the black sword, he was sure that the black sword in her hand was not a standard steel sword, and was definitely an astounding famed sword. In a situation where he did not understand the astounding effects of Xie Rou's sword, he naturally took a safe defensive position. The purple mist was powerless and was scattered by his sword. Xie Rou's figure once again appeared in his sight. However, at the same time, a wisp of sweet fragrance rushed into his mind, causing his head to suddenly sink. Poison! Huang Jinlian reacted instantly, and let out another shout in an extremely hurried manner. Using this shout and the pressure of his Zhenyuan, he spat out all the air that he had inhaled in his chest. At the same time, the golden sword in his hand gave off dazzling light and carried an indomitable presence as he slashed forward without pause. The air in front of him suddenly shook, and then there was a boom. It was as though several strong men had appeared in front of his sword and were carrying an enormous pillar towards Xie Rou. This was the mountain-beating form of the Iron Screen Sword School. This was not the most exquisite and vicious sword form of the Iron Screen Sword School, but it was definitely one of the fiercest sword forms. No matter what kind of poison was contained in the purple mist, he was still confident that he could defeat Xie Rou before the poison took effect. Xie Rou's face paled slightly. She swung the dim black sword in her hand, not towards the front, but towards the back. Her body flew backwards like a sparrow with the momentum of this sword. Many students' eyes flashed with surprise. Other than Xie Rou's sword, they started to find that Xie Rou was not as weak as they had imagined. At this moment, this soaring swallow slash was originally used to attack quickly, but now it was used by her to escape backwards. It was extremely exquisite, and the majority of them couldn't react faster or do it better. But in most people's eyes, Xie Rou could not win. Because Huang Jinlian's to change. There was a tearing sound. Before the rumbling in everyone's ears had disappeared, the sound of cloth tearing could already be heard in the air. Huang Jinlian's head was raised high. His sword turned from a slash to a slash. A crimson-red sword flame separated from his sword and flew upwards towards Xie Rou, who had just flown backwards. This sword flame looked like a burning cloud. The name of the sword style was Burning Cloud. The sword intent spanned across the sky. Even if Xie Rou had grown wings, she would not be able to dodge in time. Xie Rou could only meet it head-on. Looking at this scene, Zhang Yi was extremely nervous. Even his breathing had stopped completely. He felt that Huang Jinlian was very strong. If he was in Xie Rou's situation, he might not be able to receive this blow. The wind and rain roared, followed by thunder. In everyone's sight, Xie Rou did not care about her falling body. Her body fell freely, but the sword in her hand madly swung dozens of times in front of her. The wild sword energy stirred the primal energies of the universe to form a wind and rain. Then purple lightning appeared in the wind and rain. Many of the spectating students were even more shocked. This was the Guanzhong Mountain Wind and Thunder sword form. This blow was very strong. The presence was especially strong. They had never thought that a young girl like Xie Rou could display such a sword essence like many of the Guanzhong elites. Huang Jinlian had not expected this either. But he did not think he would lose. Thinking of Gung Ren's warning, he took a deep breath. While not letting his vital energy go berserk, he sent another wave of vital energy into the 7 luminaries' sword in his hand. Pew 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 pew. Densely packed stabs sounded. The wind and rain met the burning cloud. There was a muffled boom. In this moment, the wind, rain, and thunder all dissipated. Siero, who had been falling freely, swung high into the air, and then flew out in a strange posture like a kite with its string cut. Many people in the field had stopped breathing. Many people narrowed their eyes as they looked at Siero's flying body, thinking about how Huang Jinlian would end the battle. However, right at this moment, Huang Jinlian's powerful body suddenly stopped abruptly. The ground under his feet was soaked by fine raindrops, but as he suddenly stopped, 2 waves of dust exploded under his feet. He once again let out a shrill howl. This time, the howl was filled with intense shock. Among the scattered crimson sword flames, drifting raindrops, and fine lightning in front of him, hundreds of fine black lights were shooting towards him. At this time, only he had the time to detect these needle-like black lights. Only he could sense that these lights came from Siero's sword tip. These fine black lights came from Siero's black sword. As her vital energy surged, they flew out along with the sword move. Most importantly, these thin black lights emitted an even more intense sweet and fishy smell. In just an instant, his eyes became blurry. As the 2 waves of dust exploded under his feet, his right wrist holding the sword softly turned, and his entire arm swung rapidly in a circle. The sword light spun in front of him and expanded. The blazing golden sword light formed an open umbrella in front of him. "What sword form is this?" a student shouted in shock. This was clearly a defensive sword form more astounding than the horizontal mountain break, but he had never heard of it before. It should be one of the secret swords of the Iron Screen Sword School. The incoming fine black lights were all blocked by Huang Jinlian's sword. However, Huang Jinlian, who was frozen in place, turned pale. A wave of black energy flowed along the sword in his hand, to the hilt and then to his hand. A wave of weakness rose in his body as though he had not eaten for many days. Then his vision blurred. He could not see. A muffled bang sounded in front of him. He knew that this was the sound of Siero falling to the ground. He tried to raise his hand, wanting to throw his sword at this moment and turn it into a meteor. But his strength seemed to have been sucked out. When he raised his hand, he sensed that his sword could not reach Siero. How is this possible? His remaining strength turned into a disbelieving shout. The 7 luminaries' sword in his hand dimmed and fell to the ground. He fell forward powerlessly and knelt on the ground. What sword is this? Many gasps sounded at the same time. Some of the people who spoke were even teachers watching the battle. Everyone could clearly see that Siero's sword contained an astonishing amount of poison. The tip of her dull black sword was densely covered with many tiny holes that spewed out poison. What made them extremely puzzled was that since the poison contained in the sword was so terrifying, then Siero should have been poisoned as well. In such a collision of vital energy, such a highly toxic vital energy should have spread around her body at the same time. But at this time, Siero stood up from the ground. Her body was still trembling, but her figure caused many people to feel fear. Poison dragon blood! It is poison dragon blood! A shout came from an unknown place. Just from the voice, people could feel that this person was filled with terror. Poison dragon blood! It is! Many teachers and students of cultivation places inhaled sharply, their bodies suddenly stiffening. Finally, someone recognized this sword. In the hut, Jing Liuli sneered and said coldly. Yantai Guanjian turned his head emotionally and looked at Ding Ning in the dusk. This sword was a legend. It had once been the sword of the strongest cultivator of the last generation of the Zhao dynasty, Lian Cun. Inside the seemingly ordinary black iron sword, there was actually a core crystal taken from the body of a real poison dragon embedded in it. Based on the strength of vital energy, the core crystal would emit different poisons. The hilt of this sword was made from the horn of a yellow dragon, and could easily resolve the threat of these poisons. In the last war between the Qin and Zhao dynasties, this sword had once killed tens of thousands of Qin soldiers. But because this was a matter from decades ago, this sword had disappeared from the sight of the cultivators of the world with the passing of its master. Few people recognized it. However, this wine shop youth remembered it. Did he know that this sword had belonged to Zhao Kuo, the general of the Zhao dynasty's Qingping Pass after Lien Xiuan's death, and then returned to the Min Mountain Sword Sect's Sword Valley after the Qin dynasty's army defeated Qingping Pass? 1. Zhang Yi looked at Xie Rou, who was standing with a sword in her hand, in disbelief. But as he spoke in a trembling voice, he started to understand why Xie Rou had been able to pass the previous test more easily than most of the students present. Chapter 283. In Chongling, using poison was thought to be dishonorable. In the view of most cultivation places, this was an unorthodox path. Yet no student felt that Xie Rou's victory was unfair. This sword came from the Sword Valley of Min Mountain Sword Sect. All of them thought to themselves that even if Xie Rou did not choose this black sword, when they entered the Sword Valley, this sword would still be in the Sword Valley. They would definitely not choose this dim black sword. Compared to the students, many of the spectating cultivation teachers were more shocked. In terms of cultivation and combat experience, they surpassed the students present. So they could see that this poisonous dragon blood was very suited to the sword forms Xie Rou was skilled in. If it wasn't for that style of Guan Mountain Tempest, then this poison dragon saliva wouldn't have been able to release so much poison in such a short period of time. Xie Rou herself did not dare to believe that she had won against Huang Jinlian. She walked towards Ding Ning, Zhang Yi and the others. Looking up at Ding Ning, she could not help but want to say something. Rest. Looking at her trembling body, Ding Ning said softly. Xie Rou paused slightly and then nodded. She shyly bowed her head and started to rest. At this time, her aura was turbulent, and her internal organs had been shaken. She did need to calm down and adjust her breathing. But seeing her so obedient, Ding Ning's heart turned cold. He wondered if he had done wrong. Perhaps he should have been more indifferent to her. He Zhaoxi against Lu Duo. Many people's gazes were still on the sword in Xie Rou's hand. Their shock had yet to fade, but a cold voice sounded. The other 7 fights had not finished yet. But with the extra field, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who had arranged for the last competition did not seem to want it to be idle and immediately arranged for another fight. Of the 2 sides fighting, He Zhaoxi happened to be on Ding Ning's side. He Zhaoxi's opponent, Lu Duo, was ranked 22nd on the Book of Talent. He came from the Celestial Life Sword School and ranked much higher than He Zhaoxi. But at this time, almost everyone's gazes were on the sword in He Zhaoxi's hand. Looking at He Zhaoxi's green sword that was as thick as a horse-slaying blade, all the students on the other side of the hut unconsciously thought, "What sword was this? I am going." He Zhaoxi's eyebrows raised slightly. He said these simple words to Ding Ning, Zhang Yi and the others and then walked towards the empty field. A purple-robed youth moved at the same time. He was naturally the most outstanding disciple of this generation of the Heavenly Life Sword Academy, Lu Duo. His figure was thin and weak compared to He Zhaoxi. It was like the difference between an adult and a weak youth. But even with Xie Rou's victory, he still had absolute confidence in facing He Zhaoxi, who came from the Green Vine Sword Academy. So when he saw He Zhaoxi calmly walk out, a hint of a disdainful smile appeared at the corners of this thin youth's mouth. "Please." He Zhaoxi stopped the moment he walked into the field. Then he held his sword across his chest and said one word to Lu Duo. Lu Duo frowned slightly and also held his sword across his chest. He Zhaoxi attacked. There was a deafening boom. Two waves of dust rose under He Zhaoxi's feet as his body sped up. Lu Duo stilled, shock flashing through his eyes. He had not expected He Zhaoxi to be so direct. Also, He Zhaoxi had exploded with great power. Before Lu Duo could move, He Zhaoxi had advanced more than 100 feet. The two waves of dust rising from He Zhaoxi's feet did not disperse but charged at him like two enormous arrows. But even though he had lost the initiative, Lu Duo did not panic. He gave a clear howl, and a clear sword energy appeared in front of his silver longsword. He turned sideways, leaving behind afterimages. The clear sword energy stabbed at He Zhaoxi from the side. Attack against attack, speed against speed. He was confident he was faster than He Zhaoxi. This was because he was the fastest student in the Heaven Nurturing Sword Academy. The sword sutras he cultivated all pursued extreme speed. There was a soft hiss. A light seemed to burn on He Zhaoxi's left arm. His clothing had been torn apart by the sharp sword energy, and then started to smoke due to the friction and pressure of the air. He Zhaoxi did not have the time to change his move. His wide sword was still moving forward when Lu Duo's clear sword energy arrived first. At least, Lu Duo was much faster than him in this move. But in this moment, Lu Duo and many other students and cultivation teachers who were watching this battle showed shock and disbelief. He Zhaoxi still did not change his move. Instead, he used his left arm to meet Lu Duo's sword. Blood gushed out of He Zhaoxi's left arm with a soft sound. Then there was the sound of bone and metal grinding. Lu Duo's face turned snowy white. His sword had completely penetrated He Zhaoxi's slightly raised left arm and was stuck in his arm bone. Yet, He Zhaoxi did not seem to feel any pain. The wide sword in his hand did not slow at all. A gust of surging sword wind was pressing down on his chest as if it had materialized. In great terror, Lu Duo gave a sharp shout. He swung his silver longsword horizontally to cut off He Zhaoxi's arm and then his abdomen. But at this time, He Zhaoxi growled, and the wide sword in his hand sped up. Lu Duo's eyes were completely filled by the indigo sword energy. His fighting spirit completely collapsed. The vital energy in his body, under the threat of death, unconsciously surged out of his feet. He let go of his sword and his body flew backwards like a leaf. He Zhaoxi still advanced and raised his sword. Under Lu Duo's terrified gaze, a waterfall of blood sprayed from his chest to his abdomen. A series of gasps could be heard. A terrifying wound appeared on Lu Duo's chest and abdomen, almost cutting open the front of his body. Yantai Guanjian's figure disappeared from Jing Liuli's side. As Lu Duo's chest was spraying blood, he had appeared next to Lu Duo. In the next moment, he took Lu Duo and disappeared into the shadows of the cliffs behind them. He Zhaoxi's body swayed slightly. He stabbed the wide sword into the ground in front of him, and then gripped the silver longsword in his left arm. In the next breath, he pulled the silver longsword out of his arm. An ear-piercing sound of bone being scraped sounded. Many students paled even more. He Zhaoxi stuffed a roll of gauze into his mouth. Then his right hand moved and started to wrap the gauze around his wound to stop the bleeding. Zhang Yi was also shocked speechless. He had not expected He Zhaoxi to use such a decisive method to win this battle so quickly and directly. Su Lianhua and Xia Wan exchanged a look. Then the two of them took a deep breath in unison. They needed to calm their minds. He Zhaoxi's left arm was so heavily wounded that he feared he could not even move it. But with his left arm, He Zhaoxi had defeated Lu Duo. Other than that quick blow, Lu Duo did not even have a chance to show off. This kind of battle, this kind of winning streak, made them feel they had to re-evaluate Ding Ning's group. Blackstone Bristle, the opponent Chen Xiang, Xiao Ting against Zhao Bingzhou. Many people could not calm their breathing, but the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator responsible for the trials spoke emotionlessly. He would arrange a new match when a battle finished. Chen Liqiu against Su Lianhua. What? It was as though they had been lifted by a wave, and before they fell, another wave came. Many students could not help but exclaim when they heard this sound. Su Lianhua was stunned. Xia Wan's mouth was wide, her eyes wide in disbelief. She was one of the people who had exclaimed. Chen Liqiu was also stunned in the darkness. Why is it like this? Chen Liqiu's slightly mutated voice sounded a moment later. He looked at the expressionless Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator and said, "You did this on purpose?" Everyone could understand his feelings right now. Just now, the exclamations were not just because this was a battle between two people ranked at the top of the Book of Talents, but more because everyone knew that Chen Liqiu and Su Lianhua had been very good friends before entering this mountain valley. They had just broken off their relationship and separated the two ends of the hut. Yet, they were immediately arranged to fight between two people. For these two people, it was really too cruel. But hearing Chen Liqiu's shout, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator holding the scroll still shook his head emotionlessly. He said coolly, "I did not do it on purpose, it was casual." Chapter 284. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator's attitude was very casual when he said this. Chen Liqiu's body trembled uncontrollably, but he was speechless. No matter. Su Lianhua took a deep breath and recovered his calmness. Then he slowly walked towards an empty area. "I do not want this." Chen Liqiu walked in front of Su Lianhua and said with pain, "You are in pain because you are not willing to give up?" Su Lianhua did not look at Chen Liqiu. He just looked at the sky above Chen Liqiu's head and said calmly. Chen Liqiu's breathing paused. After a moment of silence, he said in pain, "We were once good friends." "I know. We were once good friends, so I do not want to say hurtful words." Su Lianhua said slowly and seriously, "In the following battle, I will use my full power and will not hold back. So you do not have to be merciful." Chen Liqiu looked at Su Lianhua. "Your wounds are too serious." Su Lianhua smiled self-deprecatingly. "Even if I can only fight one battle, it is good to help them defeat an opponent ranked 5th on the Book of Talent. Do you think you can defeat me?" Hearing Su Lianhua's words, Chen Liqiu was furious. "Why are you still so stubborn at this time?" Su Lianhua looked down at the furious Chen Liqiu. He calmly raised his hand and said, "Please?" Chen Liqiu's anger seemed to have been thrown into an icy lake. Looking at Su Lianhua's calm features, Chen Liqiu knew that there was no meaning in saying anything else, even if he grew angry. His left hand gripped the hilt of his sword at his waist. Then he bowed slightly to Su Lianhua and said, "Please?" The gazes of all the spectating students gathered on these two. Not just because this was a battle between two good friends from different factions, but also because these two people represented the strongest of this generation of Changling's youth. In the view of most people, the people ranked at the top of the Book of Talents would not have much difference in strength in a true battle to the death. Anything could happen. For many people, even if they could not pass the sword trials in the end, the battle between experts like this was very meaningful. The slight bow represented modesty, but for Chen Liqiu in battle, this was not an unnecessary action. As he bowed, his back slowly released a wave of vital essence, pushing the air up along his slightly bent back. Suddenly, there was some white air above his head, like a ball of auspicious clouds rising. Shock flashed through many students' eyes. After all, Chen Liqiu was an expert that they could not compare to. Chen Liqiu's first move was like a bow drawn without a shot. It was indescribably profound. The 4th level. Zhang Yi couldn't help but let out a soft cry. He sensed that other than vital energy, Chen Liqiu's body was slowly releasing some different primal energies of the universe. 4th realm, essence merging. Only cultivators who had reached Realm 4 could use vital essence to merge with the primal energies of the universe, turning their bodies into vessels for the primal energies of the universe and releasing them in battle. Zhang Yi's cultivation was already at the peak of the third realm. There was probably only one level of enlightenment between him and the fourth realm. However, this breakthrough was the most difficult step. Many people were stuck at this step their entire lives. The difference in this step was not just the difference in vital energy, but also the difference in combat methods that many Realm 3 cultivators could not understand. Chen Liqiu's Realm 4 presence meant that he would use his full power. But Su Lianhua's gaze was calm and cold. He did not move from his spot, and then swung his sword forward. The sword in his hand was made from an unknown crystal. It was slightly thinner than ordinary longswords, and faintly pink in color. It looked very delicate, but as he swung his sword, the air in front of him gave off a violent presence. There were no sword marks, but 100 feet away, a dark red arc of light like a moon appeared. This arc of light appeared directly behind Chen Liqiu and disappeared in an instant. Sand rose from the ground. Chen Liqiu's figure disappeared from his spot. A curved sword mark appeared where he had been standing. Chen Liqiu's figure appeared 10 feet away. "Qian Yueming?" Chen Liqiu said uncertainly as he tilted his head to look at the curved sword mark. The moment he spoke, Su Lianhua, who had been standing motionlessly, had swung his sword multiple times. With each swing of his sword, an arc of light would appear around Chen Liqiu. These arcs of light were dark red when they first appeared, but as more of them appeared in the air, these arcs of light grew brighter as they shone on each other. They started to look like moons. "It is Qian Yueming. I had not thought that you would finally succeed." Looking at this scene, Chen Liqiu shook his head emotionally and spoke again. As he spoke, he had officially swung his sword. Many people knew that Chen Liqiu was left-handed. He wielded his sword with his left hand. When his left hand pulled the sword out of the scabbard, the white cloud energy floating above his head suddenly condensed into glowing water droplets. Chen Liqiu's sword was completely white. Under the light of the sword, these glowing water droplets also turned white. Following the separation of his white longsword's blade and scabbard, these sparkling white water droplets didn't fall. Instead, they began to roll along with the wind like dewdrops on the morning grass. Round after round of bright moons rose into the sky as streaks of sharp sword intent slashed towards Chen Liqiu in strange arcs. The white water droplets floating in the air disappeared, and the shattered water vapor formed sword marks. None of the sword marks could get within 10 feet of Chen Liqiu. But as he sensed the increasingly sharp sword essences around him, Chen Liqiu's eyes unconsciously narrowed. His sword-drawing posture had reached its limit, and the tip of the sword had completely separated from the scabbard. He started to counterattack. His right hand stroked the edge of the sword. His fingertips were just a few strands of hair away from the sharp edge. Waves of primal energies of the universe surged out of his fingertips, colliding with the sharp edge of the sword, and then were cut into threads that scattered into the air. This was an extremely elegant sword move, like he was playing the zither. Yet, many of the spectating students changed expression. Even Xia Wan's face paled. Almost everyone could sense that the primal energies of the universe that had been cut into threads were not chaotic, but orderly as they formed a sword seal in the air. It looked simple, but it only relied on the release of vital energy and the primal energies of the universe. The subtle movements of the 5 fingers formed a sword seal. The subtlety and exquisiteness of this was not something an ordinary cultivator could grasp. The air suddenly turned cold. It was the beginning of summer, but as this sword seal formed, transparent cold energy flooded out of the surroundings. The white dew droplets immediately froze and turned to frost. The white dew turned into frost. Pieces of frost fell towards Su Lianhua, who was wielding his sword. The white frost was soft, but contained terrifying power. It dragged out white lines as though Chen Liqiu was controlling countless white swords to stab at Su Lianhua. Su Lianhua's gaze turned cold. He closed his eyes and put away his sword. The sword light began to revolve around him. Swathes of sword energy rose from the ground around him. The sword energy was translucent and slightly powdery like the petals of countless lotus flowers. 1,000-petal lotus! Chen Liqiu was shocked and said in surprise. Then, countless clear sounds of explosions rang out in the air, and the white lines flew back one after another. Chen Liqiu's right hand pressed towards the air in front of him. There seemed to be an invisible ball in his hand. However, at this moment, many faint white lines still passed through his body. Many blood lines of varying depths appeared on his skin. Even his white face had several dozen strands of red. I have never truly fought you before. So you are so strong. However, Chen Liqiu's movements didn't stop at all. The sword in his left hand pierced forward. The white sword light first collided with the invisible ball his right hand was pressing against. Everyone heard a cracking sound. The invisible ball made from vital energy and primal energies of the universe split into countless pieces. A white river appeared in front of Chen Liqiu. Su Lianhua could not breathe. He coughed with difficulty and spat out blood. His body was at its limit, but he still did not want to give up. His left hand landed on his sword hilt. He had been suppressed by Chen Liqiu's sword energy to the point of being unable to breathe. But now, he started to move forward. His sword spun violently between his hands. A straight and violently rotating sword chi shot out from the tip of the sword, condensing into the shape of a needle. Mountain drilling needle! Someone shouted in shock. The needle-like sword energy stabbed into the white river. The sword chi, which was as thin as a needle, was like a huge rock that was rampaging, and the white river collapsed bit by bit. Seeing this scene, Chen Liqiu slowly breathed. Su Lianhua was his former best friend, but everything about this battle was completely unfamiliar to him. He looked silently at the spinning sword energy that had condensed to the extreme. He did not make any changes and just steadily poured his vital energy into the sword in his hand. You will not succeed. You use a method of mutual destruction. You think that I will give up in fear of death and give you a chance. But you do not know me well enough, he said coldly inside. Chapter 285. The needle-like sword energy passed through the river and reached Chen Liqiu's brow. The long white river collapsed bit by bit, but the thousands of waves stacked layer upon layer, also smashing towards Su Lianhua's chest. This was a situation where both sides would be injured. In the view of any normal person, Chen Liqiu would dodge. Chen Lianhua was at his limit. After this attack, he feared he would not be able to use a sword move of the same power. But to everyone's shock, Chen Liqiu did not dodge. He looked silently at the sword energy that was stabbing towards his brow. Vital energy flowed steadily into the sword in his hand. All the primal energies of the universe in his body flowed along his meridians towards his brow. From his neck to his brow, white streams of energy surged out. These white streams of energy crisscrossed like he was wearing a white mask. Between his eyebrows there was a cyan mark. A condensed indigo energy, like a small indigo steel, faced the sword energy that was stabbing towards his brow. Su Lianhua's clothes were blown back by the strong wind, making fluttering sounds like flags. Some of the torn corners of his clothes even flew off his body like butterflies. In the next moment, the white waves were about to hit his body. His sword energy was about to hit the small indigo steel. But at this time, his gaze landed on the sky above Chen Liqiu's head. His sword essence flashed towards the sky. Like a butterfly, he flew up into the sky. Thousands of waves surged under his feet. There was a sharp hiss. The sword energy stabbed upwards, leaving a sword mark on the small indigo steel. Then it continued upwards. A clear hole appeared in the wild wind. The sword energy seemed to be able to pierce through the sky. Time seemed to stop. Chun Lichio's calm eyes showed incomprehensible shock. The small indigo steel in front of his brow suddenly collapsed into countless white waves. However, these white waves carried an aura that was completely different from the aura that seeped out of his body and smashed into his face with a loud bang. There was an explosion. Gasps of disbelief sounded. Chun Lichio's entire body flew backwards like a wooden stake. The clear sound of bones cracking came from the back of his neck. Then, with a muffled boom, Chun Lichio's body fell heavily to the ground, creating a cloud of dust. There was dead silence in the spectators' camp. From being hit to falling to the ground, this was a very long time in the world of cultivators. Yet even now, most of the spectating students had not realized why this was happening. Buried under the flying dust, Chun Lichio didn't die, his eyes rippling with confusion and shock. He sensed that his body couldn't move, and then he sensed that just now, his neck bones were already broken in many places. That sword essence that had almost brushed past his forehead seemed to still be floating in front of him. He faintly started to understand. That sword had used his energy to create a seal essence on his energy. Borrowed mountain scar. This is your Su Marquis Estate's borrowing mountain scar sword style. Blood gushed out between his lips and teeth. Then he shouted in even greater confusion, "Why is it like this?" His voice echoed in the mountain valley, and even covered all the sounds of battle around him. This voice echoed in the minds of many spectating students. Their gazes landed on Su Lianhua, who had just landed. Because Chun Lichio had shouted the name of this sword style, they knew that Chun Lichio's confusion was not due to the sword style itself. Multiple drops of blood dripped from the corner of Su Lianhua's mouth. Looking at his former friend in the dust, Su Lianhua was silent for a moment and said, "Because you have always been afraid of me." Chun Lichio stilled and said in disbelief, "Afraid of you? While your ranking on the Book of Talents is higher than mine, you have always been afraid that I will surpass you." Su Lianhua looked at him and slowly nodded. "The more you understand me, the more afraid you are of me, so I know just now, you will not give up because you want to finish quickly. You do not want any more accidents to happen. Also, I know that you have cultivated the indigo shirt monument." "How is it possible?" Chun Lichio shouted again. "How do you know?" "Because when you came to the trials, your eyes were filled with satisfaction and joy that you did not usually have. I knew that you had cultivated the indigo shirt monument." Su Lianhua coughed softly. Looking at his dazed eyes, he expressionlessly shook his head. "In reality, I understand you very well. Because I care about my friend's feelings, I know that you will use such a method to face my attack. Pity that you do not care about your friend's feelings enough to understand me. So you lost." After saying this, Su Lianhua looked away from Chun Lichio and turned to walk towards Ding Ning and the others. Many students finally reacted. Su Lianhua had won against Chun Lichio, and Su Lianhua had not fallen because of this. He might even face the next opponent. First was Xiero, then He Zhaoxi, and then Chun Lichio. In everyone's eyes, these three were the students most likely to be eliminated, yet they had won. Why is it like this? A blue-robed youth could not help but say the same thing as Chun Lichio. He felt that there was an inexplicable curse affecting this sword move. Zhou Wangyan. At this time, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who had casually picked names called his name. This blue-robed youth was the one who had mocked Ding Ning and had a verbal conflict with Xie Chongxing, Zhou Wangyan. Hearing his name, Zhou Wangyan's body suddenly shook. In the next moment, his body shook even more violently. Yes, Ding Ning. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator casually called out Ding Ning's name. The battlefield was deathly silent. Even many of the opposing sides had temporarily stopped fighting. This was the start of the true show. Sure. Zhang Yi turned to look at Ding Ning. While he knew that Ding Ning would appear sooner or later, for some reason, he was so nervous he could not speak. A battle without any suspense. What is there to worry about? Ding Ning glanced at him and said softly. Then he nodded in thanks to Su Lianhua, who was slowly walking back. He started to walk calmly towards the empty battlefield. Seeing Ding Ning's calm appearance, many cultivation teachers had admiration in their eyes. But when they saw the specks of white frost on Ding Ning's hair, they sighed inwardly. Jean Liuli's brow furrowed slightly. Light flashed through her eyes. She found that she was filled with anticipation. Seeing Ding Ning walk, Zhou Wangyan swallowed. Then he took a deep breath and started to walk. A cold smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. The moment they passed the sword marks on the ground and officially entered the battlefield, Zhou Wangyan looked up at Ding Ning and started to speak. The people around you have surprised many people. Zhou Wangyan sneered at Ding Ning and said, but no matter how many people on your side win, if you lose, there is no meaning. You are right. Ding Ning looked at him and responded coolly. Zhou Wangyan thought that Ding Ning would argue, and had not expected Ding Ning to say such a thing. He stilled and did not know how to respond. So I will not lose. Ding Ning looked at his shocked eyes and said calmly, also, I do not need to say these words to you because I know you are just saying these words to encourage yourself and increase your confidence. But this may have the opposite effect. Zhou Wangyan paled slightly and said coldly, I am encouraging myself? On the surface, you are more confident than when the Min Mountain sword trials just started. Ding Ning glanced at the sword hilt in his hand and said, your only source of confidence should be the sword in your hand. Zhou Wangyan's body froze and he was unable to speak. All the spectating students, including some who had stopped to watch the battle, did not understand the meaning of Ding Ning's words. The sword you chose from the Sword Valley should be the famed 100 Eyes sword of the former way. With your cultivation, there is only one possibility for you to come out of the sea of brambles without any wounds. You cultivated the Celestial Demon Chant Sword Manual of the Stillwater Sword Field. The Celestial Demon Chant Sword Manual and the 100 Eyes Sword are naturally a good combination. Just some decadent sounds can cause people to be dazed, and those ordinary insects will not know what to do and cannot fight. But this kind of decadent sound is useless against cultivators who are determined and prepared. Ding Ning stared at his eyes and said calmly, so you cannot win against me. You. Zhou Wangyan wanted to maintain his calm and pretend he did not care. But his face could not disguise it. He grew paler and his lips started to tremble. The difference is too great. Yantai Guanjian looked at the two youths from a distance, and could not help but sigh softly to Jing Liuli. He is not just targeting Zhou Wangyan, Jing Liuli said in a cold voice. He is attacking the hearts of all these people. Chapter 286. 100-Eye Sword, Celestial Demon Chant Sword Manual. Most students had never even heard of them. But looking at Zhou Wangyan's expression, everyone knew that Ding Ning was speaking the truth. In the world of cultivators, knowledge was a kind of power. At this time, all these students sensed Ding Ning's power. Ku Shichuan looked silently at Ding Ning across from Zhou Wangyan. His slightly sunken eyes were unusually red, and his hand instinctively tightened on his sword hilt. While he still had absolute confidence, he could not help but feel threatened. It was also at this moment that his slightly red eyes suddenly shrank. There were no lights in the valley, but the swords of many cultivators gave off light. So he and all the spectating students could clearly see Ding Ning turn his body slightly and glance at the ground. Almost all the students had even more shock in their eyes. There was a deep red long worm lying there. When they had first entered the valley, this long worm had shocked them. But as the trials started, they started to ignore the existence of this long worm. Ding Ning's minuscule movement reminded them all. This long worm was still following behind Ding Ning. Even though it was cowering, it still obediently followed behind Ding Ning. This represented taming. Such a scene was even more frightening. He is doing this on purpose. Seeing Ding Ning's minuscule movement, Jing Liuli said slowly in a voice only Yantai Guanjian could hear. Yantai Guanjian nodded slightly. He had the same opinion. Jing Liuli looked down and said, "But I feel that he is not so simple." "Not so simple? Then what would he do?" A hint of self-disdain appeared at the corners of Yantai Guanjian's mouth. The young geniuses of Chongling were not simple. "You cannot win against me." At this time, Ding Ning spoke calmly. He looked at Zhou Wangyan, whose face had paled, and repeated his words. Then he said seriously, "I promised Shui that I would be first. So when I attack later, I will not hold back." Zhou Wangyan's hands trembled slightly. Hearing Ding Ning's words, he could not help but shout harshly. "You say first, and you will be first. Ding Ning, do you not find this laughable?" Ding Ning looked at Zhou Wangyan, whose mind was in chaos. He did not say anything else, and calmly gripped the hilt of the last flower remnant sword, and then held his sword horizontally in greeting. "So what if I know? Those who die on the battlefield are usually arrogant but weak." Zhou Wangyan could no longer control his emotions. With a loud shout, a sword light left its scabbard with a clang. The hilt in his hand was black, and had many silver seal script. The hilt was also black, but the blade was covered in oval silver seal scripts that looked like hundreds of eyes. The moment it left the scabbard, before the vital energy completely flowed out of the blade, the wind in the valley blew across the blade. Sobs sounded from the silver seal scripts on the blade. This sound was like the crying of many women and children behind a city wall after a great battle. Vital energy surged out of Zhou Wangyan's fingers, but it was not as smooth as mercury. There were wondrous pauses. Waves of vital energy collided with each other. The entire sword started to vibrate as it moved, and the sounds from the seal scripts on the blade suddenly changed. The sobbing sounds from behind the wall became unusually sharp, like countless sharp claws were scratching the smooth surface of glass. This sound caused many spectating students to feel their hairs stand on end. Their chests were unusually tight, and they were about to vomit. But at the same time, many melodious sounds sounded in the air above, as though countless invisible figures were moving. Many people became dazed. Zhou Wangyan's sword light also became hazy in their eyes, becoming unreal. Jing Liuli's eyes were as clear as glass. She naturally could not be affected by such demonic sounds. Her gaze landed on Ding Ning. Ding Ning attacked at this time. While she, like many others, could not see Ding Ning's eyes, she could sense from Ding Ning's calm posture as he attacked that Ding Ning was not affected at all. Ding Ning's movements were not fast. When Ding Ning's body broke through the air, and the black and silver flashing sword light was just a dozen feet from Ding Ning's body, vital energy started to seep out of Ding Ning's palm. The flow of vital energy was not rapid, and only appeared steady. When Zhou Wangyan's sword was 10 feet away from him, the vital energy seeping out of his palm flowed to the front of the last flower remnant sword. Fine white flowers started to bloom on the last flower remnant sword, and then the cracks at the front of the sword split apart. Ding Ning swung his sword. His movements were soft and casual. It was like a person standing on the steps of a pavilion on a summer night, seeing fireflies flying towards them, and casually swatted them with the fan in his hand. But with this swing of the sword, many bright threads of sword energy appeared in the air. What was even more amazing was that the bright thread-like sword auras suddenly condensed into countless spots of dim fluorescence in the air, like dancing fireflies, beautiful and real. These dots of light danced towards Zhou Wangyan. Zhou Wangyan's arm suddenly straightened. As his bent arm suddenly straightened, the sword light in his hand seemed to lengthen and was about to stab into Ding Ning's chest. However, at this moment, a strange cry of fear and unwillingness came from his mouth. The demonic sound suddenly stopped, and he retreated dozens of feet away. Threads of blood slowly flowed down his body. Looking at Ding Ning, who had put away his sword, his face was filled with disbelief. Most students also had expressions of disbelief when they saw the small blood springs on Zhou Wangyan's body. Even though Zhou Wangyan could still stand, they were certain that many of Zhou Wangyan's blood vessels had been pierced, and even his organs were wounded. He could not fight anymore. In other words, with one blow, Ding Ning had defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow. As they thought deeper, these students were even more shocked. Ding Ning's blow was exquisite, and did not look like a sword form that White Goat Cave could possess. "It is the sword form of the sword nucleus," someone said in shock. The speaker was Shi Guanzi, from the Horizontal Cloud Sword Monastery, and ranked 14th on the Book of Talent. Facing the gazes of the surrounding people, Shi Guanzi said in a trembling voice, "It is one of the moves of the sword manual on the previous sword nucleus. The chaotic firefly sword form of the Han's flowing firefly sword manual." Jing Liuli turned slightly to look at Tantai Guanjian. He seemed to be speaking to Tantai Guanjian but also to himself. So he wanted to use this to bring greater terror to these people. Now, these people understand, are they scaring themselves? The atmosphere was heavy, but Tantai Guanjian could not help but laugh. The scene sank into silence again. A Min Mountain sword sect cultivator had reached Zhou Wangyan's side, and was trying to stop his bleeding. Since the Min Mountain sword sect cultivators had intervened, it meant that this fight was over. Ding Ning had turned around. The long crimson worm was a little scared, but it immediately followed his footsteps and wriggled its body to keep up. At this time, more and more students thought things through. Ding Ning had defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow. The most important reason was not his knowledge, or Ding Ning's comprehension ability. In just a short time, he had learned such an exquisite and powerful sword form from the sword nucleus. The most important reason was that Ding Ning's timing was too accurate. Each speck of fireflies was like a sharp flying blade. They danced in the air in shocking numbers. However, with Zhou Wangyan's strength, if he could receive such a blow normally, even if he could not block all the fireflies, he could at least block most of them with his sword. At least, he could ensure that some important parts of his body would not be pierced. However, Zhou Wangyan didn't have the ability to fight back at all under this sword. When Ding Ning's fireflies flew up, Zhou Wangyan had changed his move and started a killing move. Zhou Wangyan's sword essence had formed and there was no time to change it. When he drew his sword, the flow of vital essence, the sword chi cut through the air and formed a sword seal. Fireflies flew out and completed this exquisite sword move. Ding Ning's timing was perfect and impeccable. A loud round of applause broke the silence. Overjoyed, Zhang Yi turned around and saw Dugu by clapping hard. Even if he changes to a different sword form, Ding Ning should be able to easily defeat Zhou Wangyan with one blow. Looking at Zhang Yi, who had turned around, Dugu Bai had an unusual flush on his face. He said seriously, "Your junior sect brother is really strong." Zhang Yi was usually extremely humble, but when he heard Dugu Bai's praise, he was not humble and said proudly, "My junior sect brother is very strong to start with. He purposefully wants to scare people, so he used the moves of the sword nucleus." Su Lianhua swallowed hard and said with a pale face, "He scared me too." Chapter 287. The cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect had used some unknown method. In a few breaths, Zhou Wangyan's blood stopped flowing. But as he looked at Ding Ning's calmly walking back, and thought of all the words he had said in the trials, his vision darkened and he fainted. Xiero was very excited. She looked at Ding Ning, who was walking back, so excited she could not speak, her face flushed red. She had felt that Ding Ning would win, but she had not expected Ding Ning to win. Zhou Wangyan was like a teacher teaching a student. Compared to the heated atmosphere on this side of the hut, the other side of the hut was even colder. Before Ding Ning made his move, many people thought that Ding Ning was bragging, and even the fact that he had won first place was a joke. According to the records of the Book of Talents, 16 people had reached Realm 4. No matter how close Ding Ning was to Realm 4, he had not truly entered Realm 4. Even if some of the Realm 4 cultivators had been eliminated, there were still many people whose cultivation far surpassed Ding Ning. There was an insurmountable gap between Realm 4 and Realm 3. But now, Ding Ning had defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow, as easily as a Realm 4 defeating a Realm 3. Everyone had to admit that Ding Ning had the power to fight above his level. In other words, he had the power to fight for first place. Looking at the silent hut, Jing Liuli knew that Ding Ning had obtained the effect he wanted. In her view, Ding Ning's attack was not perfect, but his every movement, every word, and even his expression were perfect. From the start, Ding Ning had been at a great disadvantage and in a passive situation. Even his vital energy had been forced out by palace attendant Rome. But step by step, this wine shop youth slowly reversed the situation, and gave people the feeling that he had control of the entire situation. Zhang Yi looked proudly at Ding Ning, who was walking back. He felt his face was filled with light. He could not help but think that this was the so-called light on one's face, true glory. Yet he could not help but think of Shui Wangxiu, and tears formed in his eyes again. Zhang Yi, at this time, his breathing stopped because he heard the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who had arranged the matches call out his name. Yes, Xiaowan. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator had no special emotions on his face, and his tone was still casual. But when he said the next name, there was an uproar. Su Lianhua's expression froze. Just a moment ago, he had admired this casual Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator, but now, he almost shouted like Chen Liqiu. Zhang Yi's body stiffly turned around and looked at Xiaowan behind him. Xiaowan frowned deeply. Her expression was calm, but her hands were trembling slightly. Many people realized that they had overlooked a simple truth. While the crude hut in the middle clearly divided into two camps, the casual arrangements of the Min Mountain Sword Sect sword trials would not differentiate between camp. Ding Ning's side would not just encounter people from the other side, but also their own people. So even though Ding Ning had started with such a blow, and even though Xie Rou and Su Lianhua had won previously, it would not be so simple for them to win in the end. Among the uproar, Yi Haoran, dressed in white robes and standing out from the crowd, did not have a surprised expression. He just smiled faintly. Just like Jing Liuli, he felt that Ding Ning's previous performances were perfect. If this was a battle between two armies, Ding Ning had planned well, and caused his side's presence to completely suppress the other side. Yet, such an accident caused most of the presence he had created to disappear. He looked at Zhang Yi and Xiaowan. He looked forward to how these two's following performances would affect Ding Ning's presence. Zhang Yi subconsciously spoke. The first thing he thought of when he reacted was to admit defeat. He had not considered himself, or what it meant for a cultivator to be able to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. He only wanted his little sect brother to win in the end. In his view, it was more beneficial for the entire situation for Xiaowan to advance without any effort. But the moment he spoke, Xiaowan saw his flashing gaze and saw what he was thinking. I admit defeat. The moment Zhang Yi said the word, Xiaowan looked up and spoke calmly and firmly. Everyone stilled. How can this be done? Zhang Yi was stunned for a breath of time and was suddenly at a loss. I know what you want to say. But before he finished speaking, he was interrupted by Xiaowan. Xiaowan sat down next to Su Lianhua and then looked at the confused Zhang Yi. She shook her head seriously. Even if you think that I am stronger than you, I am not the same as you. My advancement is not a white goat cave disciple's advancement. Since I am going to help, then I will help thoroughly. Zhang Yi was stunned. While his personality was too gentle and pedantic, he was not stupid. He immediately understood Xiao Wan's meaning. Most of the students present understood the meaning of Xiao Wan's words. Ding Ning had to win for the glory of White Goat Cave. 2 White Goat Cave disciples achieving outstanding results in the trials would naturally be more glorious than 1 White Goat Cave disciple achieving outstanding result. Xiao Wan's choice was unwise in many people's eyes and impulsive. However, this represented her attitude. Because in many people's eyes, Ding Ning's actions were unwise and impulsive. I have made up my mind. Since I have publicly admitted defeat, the teachers of Min Mountain Sword Sect have recorded it. There is no meaning in you saying anything more. Looking at Zhang Yi, who still wanted to say something, Xiao Wan lowered her head and said in a deep voice. Everyone could see that she was slightly sad. She had paid too much to attend the trials. She had always dreamed of entering Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. But at this time, everyone could see her determination. Chongling has many ambitious women. Looking at the sad but determined Xiao Wan, Yantai Guanjian, standing in the hut, sighed softly. His words were clearly praising Jing Liuli. But hearing his words, Jing Liuli raised an eyebrow slightly and corrected. It is the women in the world who are ambitious. Thinking of Bai Shanshui, and the strongest of the Zhao sword furnace, Zhao Si, and the remnant sword in Ding Ning's hand, Yantai Guanjian's body shook slightly. He said seriously, "You are right. Do not be wishy-washy." Looking at Zhang Yi, who did not know what to do in front of Xiao Wan, Ding Ning sat down again. Then he looked calmly at Zhang Yi and said, "If you are embarrassed, do not disappoint other people's good intentions in the following battles." Zhang Yi's expression froze for a moment. He took a deep breath and bowed solemnly to Xiao Wan. He said softly, "I will not disappoint Miss Xia." Looking at his eldest sect brother, who had said not to be wishy-washy, Ding Ning could not help but curl his lips. He said softly, "What do you mean by not disappoint the girl? You speak as though you are discussing marriage." Hearing Ding Ning's words, Xiao Wan was slightly embarrassed and a flush appeared on her white face. Zhang Yi was shocked and said in a trembling voice, Junior sect brother, you cannot joke like this. You will ruin Miss Xia's reputation." "Rest." Ding Ning pointed at the wooden plank next to him and indicated for Zhang Yi to sit. An upright person does not fear a crooked shadow. How can one's reputation be spoken of? Seeing Ding Ning appear more casual than him, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator responsible for arranging the matches had an unusual light in his eyes. Then, he saw the 2 names on the scroll that he had casually flipped open. His eyes began to fill with an extremely interested light. He wanted to see what Ding Ning's reaction would be after he read out the 2 names. Chapter 288. He looked at Ding Ning and casually read out the 2 names on the scroll with interest. Ku Shichuan against Nangong Kaishu. As he spoke, Ku Shichuan suddenly looked up. Many low gasps sounded around him. The emotions in these soft cries were very complicated. Some of the soft cries were filled with sympathy, while others were filled with schadenfreude. Some of the soft cries were filled with relief. Many students had heard that Ku Shichuan and Ding Ning had conflicts, and Nangong Kaishu was one of the people who stood firmly on Ding Ning's side from the start. This was definitely a battle between factions, but it was also a battle between the strong and the weak. Nangong Kaishu was not even ranked in the top 50 of the Book of Talents, but Ku Shichuan was ranked 3rd. In the Sea of Brambles, Ku Shichuan had not been wounded at all, but Nangong Kaishu had been seriously wounded. For a minority, the most important meaning of this battle was that Ku Shichuan would fight in front of everyone. The Shadow Mountain Sword Cave was not an outstanding cultivation place in Chongling. While Ku Shichuan was one of the best of this generation of Shadow Mountain sword cave cultivators, he had only been slightly famous in the past. In just half a year, he had become one of the strongest of Chongling's young talents. There were many questions about this. For all the students who wanted to gain something in the Min Mountain Sword trials, this question was a danger. Ding Ning's brow furrowed slightly amidst the soft cries of various emotions. The Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator who had been expressionless until now looked at the frowning Ding Ning. An imperceptible smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. He thought, you, who are usually calm, will have times when you feel troubled and will frown like a normal person. Nangong Kaishu took a deep breath. She glanced at Ding Ning, Zhang Yi and the others, and was about to move without any fear. Admit defeat? But at this time, Ding Ning's voice sounded and reached her ears. Nangong Kaishu stilled. Why? You are not a match for him. Ding Ning looked at her stubborn features, shook his head and said seriously, there is no meaning. If other people said such words to her, she would be furious. But she was certain that Ding Ning's judgment would not be wrong. Not even a sliver of a chance? She frowned deeply and looked at Ding Ning unwillingly. Not even a sliver of a chance. Ding Ning looked at her and said, you should not even be able to injure him slightly. Nangong Kaishu was silent for a moment and said, can you guess what kind of sword manual he cultivates, or how he suddenly became so strong? Ding Ning shook his head. I do not know. Nangong Kaishu looked up at his flashing eyes in the darkness and said, I want to receive one of his blows. Ding Ning's relaxed brows furrowed again. I understand that you are worried that I will be more seriously wounded, Nangong Kaishu said seriously. Nangong Kaishu looked at him and said softly and seriously, but I promise you, I will only attack once. I will only let you see his attack, and then I will admit defeat. Ding Ning's brows did not relax, but he did not refuse. He thought for a short while and then nodded. If that is the case, then do not attack once. You need to attack twice. Nangong Kaishu stilled slightly. She did not understand Ding Ning's meaning. Ding Ning continued, against the cold, and then the 1,000 sails are exhausted. Nangong Kaishu seemed to understand but did not. Nishui Han and Qianfan were the sword moves of the Cloud Water Palace's exquisite sword scripture that she had comprehended on the sword embryo before she, Zhang Yi, and the others practiced the sword Dao. The sword moves of the exquisite water sword manual were exquisite, but the sword essence of these two moves, and even the way their vital energy moved, were very different. They could not be used together. Ding Ning did not explain and looked calmly at her. All right. Nangong Kaishu did not say anything else. She nodded and started to walk. Junior sect brother, will he really be all right? Zhang Yi hesitated for a long time and could not help but say worriedly. This is a matter of mutual trust. Ding Ning turned to look at him and said, since we trust each other, there will be no problems. Ku Shichuan, who had stopped in an empty area, looked at Nangong Kaishu, who was slowly walking over. His eyes unconsciously narrowed. He had seen Nangong Kaishu and Ding Ning talk, but he could not hear the contents of their conversation. Did Ding Ning feel that Nangong Kaishu could win against him? He felt a thread of humiliation. His right hand landed on his sword hilt. Before he held his sword across his chest, a dark and cold presence came out of his sword sheath. Many students close to Gu Shichuan immediately stopped breathing, and their gazes involuntarily fell to their feet. For some reason, they all felt a strange and dangerous aura that seemed to be coming out from under their feet. Nangong Kaishu faced Ku Shichuan. Of course, she sensed this strange presence. This presence made her wounds feel as though they had been soaked in ice water. But she kept on thinking about the two sword moves Ding Ning had mentioned. She had a thoughtful expression on her face. Gu Shichuan's expression grew even darker. He looked at Nangong Kaishu, who walked in, and said, please? Nangong Kaishu was still thinking about how the two sword moves could not be connected. She was in a daze and instinctively said, please? Ku Shichuan's expression grew darker. The deep red in his slightly sunken eyes deepened as though blood was about to seep out of his skin. He started to pull out his sword. His sword hilt was dark red, and as he moved, an even brighter red flashed out of the scabbard. The blade was even brighter red, as though a stream of blood was flowing out of his scabbard. Only now did Nangong Kaishu suddenly wake up. For normal battles, her reactions were too slow and she would easily lose the initiative. She would not even be able to judge the other's sword move. Yet, she chose to trust Ding Ning. At this time, she did not need to think or see what moves Ku Shichuan used. However, in the instant that she suddenly woke up, she let out a loud and clear cry. Without thinking, she drew her sword and attacked. The sword move was fast and natural. A sparkling and translucent stream of water formed around her in an instant. At the same time, the sword light in her hand slashed out in the opposite direction of the flow of water. This was the Cold Against the Water of Cloud Water Palace's exquisite water sword manual. If this was a large sword, Nangong Tsaishu's sword light would be like a large ship going against the current with an unyielding and rebellious presence. But the sword Nangong Kaishu had chosen in the Sword Valley was extremely small, only a foot long. The blade was strangely curved. When the sword light came out, it moved against the flow of water like a snake in the water. Even more shocking was that her sword hilt was silver, and the blade was faint white. While the small sword looked small, it possessed astounding sharpness. Most of the spectating cultivators saw in shock that this sword passed through the glowing water as though it did not exist. The water that was cut through gave people the feeling that there was a thin layer of distance between the sword and the water. Most of the cultivation teachers present were powerful cultivators. While most of them had never seen Cloud Water Palace's exquisite water sword manual, when Nangong Kaishu used this attack, they could easily judge that the power of this attack came from the sword energy of the sword and the water flowing against the flow. It created many sharp lines of water that stabbed towards the opponent like many thin water swords. But because of the uniqueness of Nangong Tsaishu's sword, in this moment, it did not create any water lines, but refracted many glowing lines of light. In a flash, the sword light in Nangong Tsaishu's hand seemed to turn into countless swords. The glowing sword lights fell towards Ku Shichuan. It was hard to distinguish which was real. Many students paled. They suddenly found that, if they were in Nangong Tsaishu's position, they might not be able to withstand Nangong Tsaishu's attack. A hint of shock flashed through Ku Shichuan's eyes, but his expression did not change. He swung his blood-colored sword, but did not face the attack. It landed diagonally on the ground in front of him. Pew 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 pew, a burst of buzzing filled everyone's ears. Under the shocked gazes of most people, countless tiny pillars of dust rose from the ground along with the strange tremors of the ground, shooting upwards. The small pillars of dust collided with each other like a sandstorm forming on the ground. Ku Shichuan's figure disappeared into the dust. But at the same time, a sharp sword essence formed amidst the roiling dust. A lot of dust twisted and changed, vaguely forming sharp objects, as if many swords were about to pierce through the dust waves. Chapter 289. A series of heavy gasps could be heard. The dust obscured the view and hundreds of swords formed. To everyone's shock, each dust sword contained real and powerful power. This kind of power did not seem to match Ku Shichuan's vital energy output. Almost all the spectating students felt that Ku Shichuan's power had been greatly amplified. Why is it like this? Before the dust swords formed, Su Lianhua frowned deeply, and could not help but ask when the pillars of dust charged out of the ground. When he asked this, he looked directly at Ding Ning because he was certain that Ding Ning's knowledge was above most people here, including the teachers of the cultivation places. Ding Ning did not turn to look at him, and answered calmly and crisply, "The real path of the sword is easier to gather primal energies of the universe." Dugubai frowned. "Earth vein sword?" Ding Ning nodded. "A kind of earth vein sword? Is there really no problem?" Hearing this, Xiaowan could not help but look at Nangong Tsaishu's figure and ask. The earth vein sword was an extremely powerful sword art. The sword energy that came out of the sword passed through the ground, and left behind a sword path that was connected to the flow of earth energy. It was like a seal script was truly carved underground, because these seal scripts were as real as the seal scripts carved on seal weapons. They could last longer than the marks left behind by sword energy in the air, so they were more effective at gathering primal energies of the universe. This kind of sword art was mostly recorded in ancient books, but had been lost in the present Chongling. No one had expected it to appear in Ku Shichuan's hands. Nangong Kaishu did not know what the earth vein sword was. At this time, she could not even sense Ku Shichuan's presence, and did not know where Ku Shichuan was in front of her. She could only sense the power of this sword, so strong that she could not match it at this time. However, since she had already agreed to unleash 2 strikes, she had already unleashed 1 strike. Naturally, she had to unleash the next strike as well. So she only thought of this 1,000 sails sword move and attacked without rest. Chi 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 in the air in front of her. There was also a sudden sharp sound of air being torn apart. Dozens of sword chi shot out from the short sword in her hand, and the sparkling and translucent water flow around her suddenly stagnated. At the same time, she felt an irresistible force pass from the sword in her hand to her body, followed by the same force in the air. Her feet left the ground in an instant, and her entire body involuntarily flew backwards. When her body started to fly backwards, she saw the white sword lights standing like a forest of sails. Just now, the 1,000 sails sword move had truly taken shape. A low shout of indescribable meaning sounded in the curtain of dust. Accompanied by muffled collisions, the white sword lights that stood like sails were shattered by the dust swords that came out of the curtain of dust. But at this time, Nangong Kaishu, who was flying backwards, understood the use of the second sword. "I admit defeat." She simply lowered her sword in the air and spoke. Then, her heart was inevitably filled with shock. Disbelieving gasps sounded at this time. At this time, everyone reacted. Nangong Tsaishu's second sword move was meant to retreat, to escape the range of Ku Shichuan's sword move. But this 1,000 sails sword was clearly an offensive move. Even most of the cultivation teachers had not expected this move to have such an effect when they saw Nangong Kaishu use it. The previous move, Cold Against the Water, was also an offensive move, but when the 2 offensive moves were connected together, it created such an effect. When the second sword move formed, the recoil pushed Nangong Kaishu far back. If Nangong Kaishu was familiar with sword moves, people would not be so shocked. This Cloud Water Palace sword manual had only been learned during the sword embryo comprehension. How could Nangong Kaishu know how to use such an unfamiliar sword move? Everyone's gazes gathered on Ding Ning. While other than Zhang Yi and the others, no one else had heard Ding Ning and Nangong Tsaishu's conversation. Everyone was certain that these 2 sword moves could only have come from Ding Ning. How long had Ding Ning looked at the sword embryo? Was there such a monster in the world with such comprehension ability? Interesting. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator responsible for arranging the last event stilled slightly and murmured to himself. Then he couldn't help but sigh. Extraordinary. Jing Liuli, who was responsible for the entire trials, and the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators who were responsible for each segment of the trials, they were special existences in Min Mountain Sword Sect. Ordinary Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators could not compare to them. Yet, almost all of the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators responsible for each segment of the trials said extraordinary of Ding Ning's performance. This had never happened in the history of the Min Mountain Sword trials. the dust swords suddenly dissipated. Dust was a very soft thing, but when Ku Shichuan's sword essence disappeared, all of the dust floating in front of Nangong Kaishu suddenly fell down like a curtain and gave people an unusually heavy feeling. Ku Shichuan's figure appeared behind the heavy curtain of dust. His sword had returned to its sheath, his robes clean as new, and he appeared very free. He had only used one blow to win this battle, but his expression was even darker. Nangong Tsaishu's direct surrender meant that his murderous intent had nowhere to go. It was like he had raised his hand to hit someone but could only put it down in the end. Even though he had shown such astounding strength, everyone's focus was still on Ding Ning. Even the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator's words were directed at Ding Ning. "I hope I can meet you." He took a deep breath and looked at Ding Ning from a distance. Then he silently turned and walked back to where he had been standing. He knew that he had to win or he could defeat Ding Ning in this trial. Otherwise, he could not take revenge for the humiliation he had suffered before. The winning side seemed to be the losing side. The losing side seemed to have won and regained some of their momentum. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who arranged the trials sighed softly. Amazing! He decided to make the trials more interesting. So he flipped through a name, and then casually looked at a name on a scroll at the side. Then he said, "Zhang Yi." The scene suddenly became silent. Zhang Yi exchanged a look with Su Lianhua and the others around him. He even thought he had heard wrong, or that the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator had made a mistake. But the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator continued, "Against Xia Song. Me against Zhang Yi?" Before someone on Ding Ning's side could ask, a cold questioning voice sounded. The speaker was a youth dressed in black robes. He frowned slightly and looked at the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator with undisguised discontent. Yes, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator, who did not show much emotion, glanced at him and said. The black-clothed youth was unable to restrain his anger. He said in a deep voice, "Zhang Yi and I have already finished the first round. The others haven't even finished the first round. Is it really fair to arrange for us to fight each other?" Facing the black-robed youth's question, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator asked emotionlessly, "Who set the rule that all students must pass the first round before the second round?" The black-robed youth was stunned. This was common knowledge in ordinary competitions, but this was the Min Mountain Sword Trials. The rules of the trials were set by Min Mountain Sword Sect, or rather, by this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who did not show his emotions on his face. "You are all people who have passed one round. What is unfair about this? I will remember the number of rounds, and will not have you fight one more round." The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator looked at the stunned black-robed youth and said expressionlessly, "The time you finished the competition was close to when Zhang Yi won against Xiaowan. It is naturally the fairest for you to compete. If you insist on saying it is unfair, I can only say that your luck is not as good as Zhang Yi, and you did not encounter an opponent who forfeited. It is not wrong to remember the number of rounds." The black-robed youth bowed to the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator to express his apology. He had quickly calmed down, but the students and cultivation teachers who were watching quickly sank into indescribable shock. "You did not do it on purpose this time?" Su Lianhua's furious voice suddenly sounded. He looked directly at the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator, his eyes burning with anger. The black-robed youth was naturally Zhang Yi's opponent, Xia Song, that the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator had reported. Su Lianhua's anger was because Xia Song was ranked 11th on the Book of Talent. Can your anger be understood as you do not have confidence in your friend? Looking at Su Lianhua's furious eyes, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator gave a rare smile and then said expressionlessly, "I am still casual. I just randomly picked one student from the first batch who finished the competition." Of course, I did not deliberately arrange a strong opponent for him. Chapter 290. Hearing this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator's answer, Su Lianhua sneered. How can you prove that you are just randomly picking and not deliberately picking? Who knows if you have any selfish motives? Su Lianhua's question was sharp, and even carried a malicious accusation. Ordinary students would not dare to say such thoughts, but Su Lianhua's father was one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. He had enough status and courage to say such a thing. Thinking of He Shanjian's previous encounter, the teachers present who did not know this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator felt cold inside. They watched closely to see how this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator would answer. But this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator did not care and said coolly, I am the proof. You? Su Lianhua said with slight disdain, How? This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator looked up slightly and said, Because I am Lin Suixin, I always do as I please, and will never be influenced by anyone. Even Bailey Sushue cannot influence me. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator still had no clear emotion on his face, and his tone was still casual. But when they heard his name, gasps sounded. These gasps were several times louder than when Ding Ning had defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow. Even someone as proud as Su Lianhua was stunned. His eyes were wide as he looked in shock at this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator. He only said one word, but he used honorifics. In the previous trials, people like Sect Uncle Gung Ren and Sect Uncle Qing Yaoyin appeared. This last trial concerns the final advancement. How can these people feel that Sect Uncle Lin is more ordinary than Sect Uncle Gungren and the others? Jing Liuli said disdainfully as she looked at the shocked students and teachers present. But even she looked at this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator with more respect than Gungren and the others. You should understand now that I will not be influenced by others, and will not purposely make things difficult for your side due to external factors? Looking at the speechless Su Lianhua, the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator said calmly. Su Lianhua came back to her senses and bowed with true respect. Her voice trembled as she said, I have no objections. I didn't expect him to be Senior Lin Suixin. Dugubai looked at the cultivator who did not care about Su Lianhua's reaction and looked down at the book in his hand. He could not help but say softly, Actually, this sword trial, just seeing these legendary people is worth it. Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate were undoubtedly the strongest cultivation sects in the world. This strength was not just because they had one or two especially powerful cultivators, but many powerful cultivators, and even legendary cultivators. Among the many legendary cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Lin Suixin was the only one who could ignore Bailey Sushue's thoughts. Because he was Bailey Sushue's Shixiang, and had once been the sect leader's Shixiang, he was the sect leader's successor. But because his personality was too casual, he quickly gave the position of sect leader to Bailey Sushue. Even his cultivation was too casual. His cultivation depended entirely on his mood, and he did not purposefully pursue realms. So in some rumors, he was a cultivator like the Yuanwu Emperor who could reach Realm 8. But because he did not pursue realms, only the Yuanwu Emperor had reached Realm 8. There were many stories about his carefree nature. It was because of his carefree nature that he was willing to go deep into the desert to hunt down a group of powerful bandits for a cultivator who had nothing to do with him. Those bandits were even more powerful than him. Because of his casualness, he had refused the invitations and requests of countless nobles. Even when the previous sect leader of Min Mountain Sword Sect and the present Bailey Sushue asked him to fight, he had refused. A person's character was not determined by their performance in one matter, but the manifestation of their choice in many life and death moments. So no one doubted that Lin Suixin would bend to the wishes of some people. Everyone even knew that Lin Suixin would appear in the final stage of the trials because of his own interest. Since no one had objections, the battle between Zhang Yi and Xia Song would naturally start. Do not be wishy-washy. Ding Ning looked at Zhang Yi. He was the junior sect brother, but he said seriously like a teacher, "You have to understand, facing an opponent like this, even if you want to kill the other, you cannot." Thinking that he, as the senior sect brother, had to trouble his junior sect brother, Zhang Yi nodded with some shame. "When you hesitate, think of Shui." Ding Ning nodded and then added. Zhang Yi was stunned and bowed his head slightly. "I know, little sect brother." After saying this in a low voice, he didn't say anything else and turned around. Usually, Zhang Yi would only call Ding Ning little sect brother out of habit when his emotions were greatly fluctuating. Zhang Yi is wishy-washy because he is too kind and generous. Looking at Zhang Yi's back, Su Lianhua turned to look at Ding Ning. She did not hide her thoughts from Ding Ning and said in a cold voice, "You mentioning Shui at this time is forcing him to go all out?" "I understand what you mean." Ding Ning looked at Su Lianhua, who had a cold expression, and said calmly, "You feel that he will not easily admit defeat, because I mentioned Cave Master Shui to him when he is not a match for Xia Song. This way, he may fight to the point of losing his life. You care so much because you think of him as a true friend. But do not forget, he is my senior sect brother. The old man is not here now. He and Shen Yi are my closest family in White Goat Cave. I care more about their safety than you. I understand my senior sect brother better than you." After a pause, Ding Ning turned to look at Zhang Yi, who had walked onto the field. He said softly and seriously, "He is definitely stronger than all of you imagine." Ding Ning's words had an indescribable calming power. Su Lianhua calmed down and frowned slightly. He said, "You mean he may win against Xia Song?" In a true battle, cultivation is not the deciding factor. There are many other factors, such as intelligence. My senior sect brother is smarter than most people, Ding Ning nodded and said. Su Lianhua grew silent. He thought of how he had been seriously injured in the Sea of Brambles with his cultivation, but Zhang Yi had brought him out unharmed. So he felt that Ding Ning was right. On the other side of the hut, none of the students thought highly of Zhang Yi. Even if they had seen Zhang Yi's performance in the Sea of Brambles, they likely would have felt that Zhang Yi would undoubtedly lose. Those who wrote the Book of Talents had to be great cultivators who were knowledgeable and understood cultivation. So almost all the cultivators in Chongling acknowledged the authority of the Book of Talent. Zhang Yi had not even entered the top 50 of the Book of Talents, but Xia Song was ranked 11th. Zhang Yi had been cultivating in White Goat Cave. White Goat Cave was only a third-rate sect in Chongling. So when Shui Wangshu displayed Realm 7 cultivation, it was even more shocking. Xia Song was a student of the Heaven Awareness Sword Field. The Heaven Awareness Sword Field was not as powerful as the two super sects, Min Mountain Sword Sect and Spirit Void Sword Sect, but it was one of the strongest cultivation places right behind them. Last spring, Xia Song had already comprehended Qi activity in the Heaven Cultivation Courtyard of the Heaven Understanding Sword Field and entered the 4th realm, but Zhang Yi was still in the 3rd realm. Xia Song thought so as well. So when he saw Zhang Yi walk in front of him with his head bowed, this powerful black-robed youth raised an eyebrow. He put his right hand on the sword hilt at his waist and nodded to Zhang Yi. He said, "You can attack." Zhang Yi bowed slightly. He held the Zhao Sword Furnace sword that seemed to burn with fire in front of his chest and said, "Brother Xia, after you?" Xia Song stilled. "You want me to attack first?" Zhang Yi said respectfully, "Brother Xia just fought one more round than me. I naturally have the advantage." Hearing Zhang Yi's response, an imperceptible disdain appeared at the corners of Xia Song's mouth. In his view, from the start of the trials, Shui Wangshu's death, and Ding Ning's unyielding attitude, The trials had been bloody for everyone in White Goat Cave. Yet, Zhang Yi was still acting like this. Just like the rumors, he was too pedantic and docile. Such an opponent naturally made him look down on him. Since that's the case, please. He did not decline. His right hand slowly landed on the slightly yellow sword hilt, and then he attacked. With a hum, a straight sword energy cut forward as though it was tangible. In a moment it split into three and continued to cut straight towards Zhang Yi. This was a very ordinary three-part sword form. The reason he used such a sword form was that he did not want to take advantage of Zhang Yi. The second reason was that this was a very reliable sword essence. In his view, as long as his cultivation was higher than his opponent's, he only needed to win steadily. Zhang Yi looked up. Facing the three sword energies coming at him, he chose to jump up. Two blasts of air rushed out from under his feet, and he leaped high into the air. The scorching hot sword in his hand was also swung forward. The air immediately became wet. Feeling the moisture, Xia Song did not move from his spot. The disdainful smile at the corner of his mouth grew. The sword in his hand stabbed upwards at an angle. With a slight movement of his wrist, a blurred light screen was emitted from his sword. Know yourself, know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. He had heard of Zhang Yi's attack at Falling Parasol. He knew that Zhang Yi had comprehended a powerful sword essence in the Zhou family ink garden. Countless sharp lines of rain would fall from the sky and cover a wide area. But since it was rain, he only needed an umbrella. Heaven knowledge sword field happened to have a powerful sky-gauging umbrella sword move. The blurry curtain of light spread upwards like an unusually grand umbrella. But the umbrella was ready, but the rain did not fall. The water gathered in front of Zhang Yi, who had jumped up and suddenly gave off a shrill sound. A sparkling stream of water followed Zhang Yi's sword at a terrifying speed, like a twisting dragon in the air, fiercely crashing towards Xia Song. Shock flashed through Xia Song's eyes. His breathing paused, and he forcibly suppressed the sword momentum. With a loud bang, the downward light curtain and the sparkling and translucent water fiercely collided with each other, creating a huge splash. His reaction was fast, but his sword move was finished. Yet Zhang Yi's sword move was not finished. At this moment, his hair started to dance like snakes. He tried to control the flow of vital energy in his body. At the most dangerous moment, he tried to channel it into his sword as quickly as possible. Boom! A huge tremor rang out without stopping. A wave of fire surged out of his sword and burned the flying water droplets. In a moment, the water droplets turned into a hot mist that slapped in front of Xia Song. All the spectating students held their breath. Even the students far away could feel the heat wave coming at them. Everyone was certain that Xia Song would not be able to react in time and could not completely escape the range of the mist. Su Lianhua was also completely stunned. He did not expect Zhang Yi to have such a change and be able to launch such a powerful attack. To be able to infer three from one example, this is my senior sect brother. Ding Ning looked calmly at the burning wave of air and said softly. Chapter 291. As Ding Ning spoke, a shrill scream sounded from the scorching wave of air. Along with this shrill scream, the scorching heat wave that was like a huge wave suddenly paused. Then, it was blasted into countless white lines by a terrifying force and shot out in all directions. Xia Song's figure appeared in the center of the explosion. His presence did not stop, and a layer of energy pulsed rhythmically outside his robes. Many spectating students felt uneasy, and immediately thought that Xia Song had used some astounding method to completely block Zhang Yi's attack. However, in the next moment, when they saw Xia Song's face, they could not help but cry out in surprise. Xia Song's originally fair and handsome face was now covered with blisters, sparkling and translucent. It was extremely painful to look at. Is he still too wishy-washy? Seeing this scene, Su Lianhua frowned slightly and could not help but say to Ding Ning. Xia Song's face was terrifying, and as a Realm 4 cultivator, he was certain that Su Lianhua just now, in order to not be cooked, had used all the primal energies of the universe he had accumulated in his body. But Xia Song was still standing and able to fight. As long as he could continue to fight, even if all the primal energies of the universe in his body were used up, Xia Song's vital energy was above Zhang Yi's. As a Realm 4 cultivator, he would have more profound fighting methods than Zhang Yi. In his view, since Zhang Yi's attack had worked, he should not give Xia Song any chance to breathe and continue attacking. But Zhang Yi seemed to be unable to bear seeing Xia Song and did not immediately attack. Most people present, even experts like Dugu Bai, Xia Wan, and Exian, thought the same as Su Lianhua. They thought that Zhang Yi's pause and waiting had caused his advantage to disappear. Waiting for what? Do you think this attack can defeat Xia Song? On the other side of the hut, someone sneered. My senior sect brother is a man of his word. But facing such a question, Ding Ning shook his head and said calmly, since my senior sect brother promised me, he would not be wishy-washy. He is only waiting because of other considerations, and not because of this. Su Lianhua frowned slightly. He did not agree with Ding Ning's opinion. Personality problems were often the hardest to overcome. At this moment, Xia Song had already spoken. I admit I underestimated you. Xia Song didn't deliberately look at any part of his body, but the sparkling luster he saw from the corners of his eyes let him know what kind of scene his face and skin were. When he thought about how he looked in everyone's eyes, this feeling was even more unbearable than the pain. It was to the point that his hands, which were usually abnormally stable, started to tremble. But you should not be too proud, and think you can defeat me with one blow. Xia Song's white-helmeted sword light shook. It was stopped by this crimson-red goat horn and showed signs of slowing. In the violent vibrations, the glowing blisters on Xia Song's skin all burst. His body seemed to be dripping with sweat and droplets of liquid. Xia Song was in greater pain. So he gave an even harsher shout, and the sword in his right hand continued to press forward. The crimson-red goat horns slanted upwards and Zhang Yi's feet were slightly off the ground. It was as if the difference in strength between a goat and its opponent was too great. His entire body could not withstand it and was about to be knocked off the cliff. The Zhao Sword Furnace's longsword was the best in the world. Under the great force, it was only slightly bent but cracked. Because it did not break, Zhang Yi let go. Amidst the confused gasps, Zhang Yi decisively let go of the Zhao Sword Furnace sword in his right hand. There was a hiss. The crimson-red longsword flew backwards and flashed past his face like a burning red cloud. It even singed a piece of hair by his ear, but his gaze was still calm. Because this sword was separated from his hand, it was like a goat whose horn was broken. In this instant, the power could not be transmitted to his body, so his feet once again landed on the ground. It was like a goat finally paid the price of a broken horn, temporarily not being directly thrown off the cliff by his opponent. At the same time, his left hand that had been hidden in his sleeve reached out like lightning. His sleeve split open. A slightly curved sword light flickered upwards from his torn sleeve. A wave of even louder exclamations rang out like a tide. Even Xia Wan's eyes were wide in shock and she could not help but cover her mouth. The sword light that rose up from Zhang Yi's sleeve was very short and simple. It did not even have any dazzling light, but this sword light still formed a thick goat horn that rose up. It was another Ares hanging horn. Just a change of hand, a change of sword. An enormous boom sounded in the air again. The anger and burning desire in Xia Song's eyes immediately turned to shock and disbelief. He felt his sword stop, as though it had hit a mountain. That short sword that seemed to be carved from ordinary stone, in Zhang Yi's hand, was even more powerful than the Zhao sword furnace sword. How is this possible? His breathing completely stopped, and his advancing body stopped. His attack had been completely stopped by Zhang Yi, but he would not admit defeat like this. He still felt that he could win against Zhang Yi. His sword hilt suddenly fell down. As his wrist moved, the sword hilt smashed towards Zhang Yi's abdomen like a small hammer. Zhang Yi, who had been firmly rooted to the ground, retreated. He took a step back. Because his feet were deeply rooted in the earth, when he took a step back, a cloud of dust exploded under his feet. As he retreated, the tip of the short sword in his left hand stabbed towards the middle of Xia Song's sword, causing Xia Song's sword hilt to shift and float towards the empty space to the left of Zhang Yi's abdomen. At the same time, Zhang Yi's right hand formed a sword and stabbed towards Xia Song's neck. Xia Song screamed in shock and anger. His left hand formed a fist and punched towards Zhang Yi's right wrist. But with a hiss, deep bloody marks appeared on his fist and sprayed out a spray of blood. In the blink of an eye, Zhang Yi's 5 fingers had turned from thorns to claws, fiercely grabbing onto his fist. With this grab and pull, Xia Song's body slightly lost balance. From the start of the battle until now, Zhang Yi let out a low shout for the first time. His body suddenly moved forward, and as he took a step back to his original position, he had already cut into Xia Song's midline and crashed into Xia Song's chest. His right shoulder was like a hammer that hit Xia Song's heart. There was a muffled bang. Most of the spectating students felt their eyebrows twitch and their mouths become inexplicably dry. Pew! Xia Song vomited blood. The sword hilt in his right hand was smashing towards Zhang Yi's back. But his body was already flying backwards, and the tip of his sword only brushed past Zhang Yi's shoulder. This is Shue's life-bond sword? Seeing Xia Song's figure flying in the air, Su Lianhua's furrowed brows loosened. He took a deep breath, and his gaze fell on the short sword in Xia Song's hand as he asked softly. Chapter 292. The hilt of the short sword in Zhang Yi's hand was soaked in blood. Even though he had relied on 2 consecutive moves of the Ares hanging horn to block Xia Song's Heaven and Earth Unite attack, the powerful force had split the web between his thumb and index finger and ground his palm. However, at this moment, he was still holding the small sword very tightly. He was using so much force that strands of blood were squeezed out between his fingers. The short and small sword in his hand appeared even rougher and dimmer after being still. It even had some clear granules, and seemed to be made from ordinary stone. Looking at this small sword, and hearing Su Lianhua's question, Ding Ning nodded calmly. "I thought that Shui had passed this sword to you," Su Lianhua said seriously after a moment of silence. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "Senior sect brother is more generous and steady than me. Naturally, this sword will be passed to him." As the two spoke, Xia Song fell heavily to the ground and was unable to stand up. The shock of many people present had just started. The small sword that Zhang Yi gripped tightly was naturally Shui Wangshu's life-bond sword that had shocked all of Chongling last winter. While the true power contained in this life-bond sword had dissipated as its master aged and died, and it had become a lifeless object again, after Shui Wangshu's lifetime of nurturing, this sword and the many sword manuals of White Goat Cave would complement each other. At least, when he used the White Goat hanging horn move just now, there was likely no sword in the world more suitable than this sword. In the past, Chongling did not have a high opinion of Zhang Yi. But now, this sword had not appeared in Ding Ning's hands, but in his. What shocked the spectating students and the cultivation teachers the most was that when they thought of the battle just now, how Zhang Yi had taken the initiative and then stopped. It seemed that Zhang Yi had been waiting for Xia Song to attack in anger. Only with such calculations could Zhang Yi have been able to use the white goat hanging horn with both hands in such a short time. So Zhang Yi's pause and wait was not because of his soft and generous personality. Even at the end of the battle, Zhang Yi's close combat ability was even better than Xia Song's. All of this caused the spectating students to realize that Zhang Yi was not as weak as they had imagined. He gave off such a feeling because he was humble and low-key. At this time, the student who had sneered and asked what Zhang Yi was waiting for, and then felt something was wrong because of Xia Song's words before his counterattack, finally realized why he had felt something was wrong. Xia Song had said that Zhang Yi was proud. But now, thinking back, from the start of the trials until now, even after defeating Xia Song, who was ranked 11th on the Book of Talents, Zhang Yi only had an apologetic expression in his eyes. When had pride ever appeared on his face? From a certain point of view, Zhang Yi was not a hidden expert. The life-bond sword that Shui Wangshu had left him could not be of decisive use. But the more so, all the spectating students felt inexplicably cold. Zhang Yi slowly put away the small sword in his left hand. Looking at Xia Song, who was coughing up blood on the ground, he was very apologetic. In the end, he could not help but bow and say seriously, "Apologies, but I have never underestimated you. I never thought I could defeat you with one blow." Xia Song clearly knew that Zhang Yi was sincerely apologizing, but at this moment, he felt even more ashamed and resentful. With a puff, he spat out another mouthful of blood. The strength of a group of people is more terrifying than the strength of one person, Jing Liuli said to Yantai Guanjian next to him. Then he looked towards the tent of palace attendant Rong and said with slight disdain, "Even sect Uncle Lin feels that this trial is becoming more interesting. I want to see how that person prepares to end it." While Ding Ning's side had Nangong Kaishu and Xiao Wan withdraw from the trials, after Zhang Yi defeated Xia Song, Ding Ning's side had become stronger. Seeing Zhang Yi walk back towards Ding Ning and the others, a rare smile appeared at the corners of Lin Suixin's mouth. Just like Jing Liuli said, he felt that this trial was becoming more interesting. So after Ding Ning defeated Zhou Wangyan in one blow and intimidated the crowd, he arranged for Nangong Kaishu, Zhang Yi, and Xiao Wan to fight. This kind of arrangement naturally had some elements of purposefully suppressing the presence Ding Ning had created. The reason was because he wanted to see what method Ding Ning would use to recover the presence he had worked so hard to create. The battle between the two sides of the hut was no different from two armies fighting. What he wanted to see was Ding Ning's abilities as the commander. Now, not just Ding Ning, but even Zhang Yi and the others had shown abilities that surprised him. Since he had seen clearly, he naturally had to make some compensation to make this trial fairer. So without looking down at the scroll in his hand, he called out a name. Dugu Bai. At this time, many people were still in shock. When they heard these three words, another wave of heavy breathing sounded out like a tide. Facing Zhong Jingqiu, Lin Suixin casually flipped through the scroll and read the first name his gaze landed on. "It is my turn to fight." Hearing the name of his opponent, Dugu Bai only glanced at Ding Ning, Su Lianhua and the others. He said calmly and started to walk towards Zhang Yi. Before the last trial started, he had focused on cutting many wooden swords. At this time, these wooden swords were piled on the ground by his feet like firewood. He didn't even bring these wooden swords with him. As for his opponent, a young man in blue, his face was as white as snow, and he was on the verge of crying. Dugu Bai had never fought in Chongling, but when the Book of Talents came out, all the young geniuses of Chongling thought that Dugu Bai would be first in the Book of Talents. While Lai Yinghong was first in the Book of Talents, in many people's minds, Dugu Bai was still first. On the other hand, Zong Jingqiu, who came from the Jade Toad Taoist Temple, was ranked below the 30th spot in the Book of Talents. Moreover, his left leg was injured, and even his movements were somewhat inconvenient. In anyone's eyes, this was a battle where the difference in strength was too great. Dugu Bai and Zhang Yi nodded and bowed to each other. Then they continued to walk into the arena where Zhang Yi and Xia Song were fighting. Dugu Bai muttered to himself for a moment as he looked at his opponent, who was struggling to walk over with his sword, and looked like he was about to cry. Then, he said, "You are heavily injured. I will only attack once. As long as you can receive one of my attacks, I will admit defeat." "Only one attack?" Gasps sounded. Zong Jingqiu, who was about to cry, was stunned. He looked up in disbelief, a light of hope appearing in his eyes again. "This is too arrogant," Xiaowan couldn't help but frown and say. She did not doubt Dugu Bai's strength. She was certain that Dugu Bai usually had the power to casually defeat Zong Jingqiu with one blow. But now that he had said this, Zong Jingqiu did not have to think too much and just needed to focus on defense. While his injuries were not light, he would not have any problems in a defensive sword form filled with sword essence. In her view, Dugu Bai's actions were too dangerous and unnecessary. He wants to attack the other side's morale. Hearing Xiaowan's words, Zhang Yi, who had just walked in front of her, explained softly and seriously, "Previously, my junior sect brother Ding Ning defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow and caused the other side's morale to suffer a great blow. If he also defeats his opponent with one blow, the other side will be even more nervous. When the pressure is too great and they are too nervous, they will often make mistakes." These words were not hard to understand. Xiaowan's frown slowly relaxed. She looked at Zhang Yi's gentle face and nodded. She said, "Your junior sect brother is right. Zhang Yi, you are much stronger than we imagined." No. Zhang Yi's face immediately flushed and he shook his head. "Much stronger than we imagined. We have to add a condition, when you are not wishy-washy." Seeing Zhang Yi like this, Su Lianhua could not help but smile disdainfully. She snorted and said, "Truthfully, just now, I am surprised that you are not wishy-washy in your fight with Xia Song." Zhang Yi lowered his head in shame and said, "Earlier, junior sect brother reminded me, and it was Miss Xiaowan who allowed me to enter this round." "If I lose because of my wishy-washy, how can I face Miss Xiaowan?" "So it is because of Xiaowan." Su Lianhua smiled. Zhang Yi stilled. He felt this was not right, but did not know how to explain. His face flushed red but he could not speak. Xiaowan's face also flushed slightly and she glared at Su Lianhua. Everyone knows that Dugu Bai is strong, but how strong will depend on this blow. Su Lianhua turned her head and her expression quickly became serious as she said in a deep voice. Xiaowan's attention was successfully diverted. Her eyes unconsciously contracted because at this time, Dugu Bai was slowly pulling out his sword. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.